Today, I'm talking to the man behind the Electric Underground, a content channel dedicated to the coverage and discussion of arcade games, among other things. Mark, welcome to the No Frauds Club. Today, I want to kick things off just by talking about something you covered in As of Right Now in recording your latest video on Ghosts and Goblins Resurrected. You talk about how playstyles are in some ways struggling to be expressed in modern games and games that have a lot of modern designs. And if you adopt limitations to the player, what the player is able to do in their games and such, that actually improves in some ways the breadth of different choices you have. You give a couple of examples in that video. I'll obviously have a link in the description for it, and people can check out the rest of your content there as well. But I wanted to ask you, it's sort of like, if you had to restate it just very briefly, the thesis of how can you convince somebody who doesn't already agree, because I'm fully on board, by the way, but the idea of playstyles not really being able to be expressed if you have all of the choices at once. What is it about having so many different choices that makes it so that bizarrely you don't really have as much choice as a player?
Yeah, well, awesome. It's really cool to be on the No Frauds Club. Am I officially not a fraud?
You
if
are
I'm on the
officially
show?
not a fraud.
Yes.
Yeah, that's all it
Yes,
took.
I'm going to put that on my page.
There it is.
Yeah, awesome. So you know that there's a phrase that a lot of people will use when they talk about pixel art and they talk about video game music where they say limitation breeds creativity. You'll hear that all the time. And it's funny, you'll hear that in all kinds of different contexts across many art forms, not just video games. But the one area that people don't seem to accept this, or, mainstream reviews and critics don't seem to accept this, is with gameplay mechanics. It's this view that gameplay mechanics, since the days of Pac-Man, ironically, a very well-made, underappreciated game there. Since the days of Pac-Man, those are the cave painting era of video games. And since then, it's just been this upward trajectory of third-person cameras and parries and combos and air juggles and all this, and that all these other choices of the past, like, for example, in Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, have that dedicated jump. You can't control the jump in the air. It's just this dedicated jump. That was because they just didn't know about fully controllable jumps. And so, the idea of like a modern game now is giving the player as many options as possible, whenever possible. And you'll see this in something like Devil May Cry, for example, where Devil May Cry 3 had the style select. So you had Trickster, Royal Guard, um, the other two are Gunslinger, and the last one, I'm going to get it, Gunslinger and Swordmaster. Okay, so you had those four styles. And then in Devil May Cry 4, they brought in, okay, you can style switch on the fly. And then what happened is everyone's like, oh, this is like the correct way to play Devil May Cry. So they actually went back and modded it into Devil May Cry 3. And then the Switch port now has it officially in there. So Devil May Cry 3 now has this style switching thing. And if you talk to a lot of players and critics now, everyone will say, this is an improvement. This is objectively better because now you can do anything. You can do a gunslinger into a trickster, into a swordmaster, into a royal guard. The funny thing is that if you take all the options and you give the player all the options, what will happen is it actually creates a natural singular play style of efficiency where you have no limitations and no trade-offs. So you will always do the most efficient thing. And so it actually homogenizes play styles, because why would you do this when you can do the better option? And I said this in the Third Strike with like Chun-Li. Chun-Li's every move can become a super. So everything becomes super. And so if you watch Chun-Li players in Third Strike, they all have to play the same way because it's so efficient. And so without trade-offs, you actually get a uniform style of play. If you have the ultimate character that can do everything, everyone will play that character, and everyone will play that character in the exact same way. And so that's a concept that fighting game players and action game players now they're kind of discussing it, but it crosses across all different genres, even platformers, even strategy games. The idea of like the optimal build will actually start to crowd out player choice and play style because you're stupid if you don't do it. So that was kind of the little summary there, where like limitation creates risk and reward and creates trade-offs. If there's no risk, if there's no trade-off, how do you as a player express yourself? You just learn to play optimally and that's it. There's nothing left to it.
Yeah, and it feels like really the diamond in the rough is the game that often unintentionally, which of course is going to be a subject later about intentional design, but sticking with this expressivity thing, like the reason why I framed it as play style more than skill is I'm really interested in high skill expression, but you can have high skill expression that doesn't actually look that interesting. And I would actually
Oh
argue
yeah.
a point that you made in another one of your videos about gameplay density is the whole concept of speedrunning and how that's like one challenge that you can do. But oftentimes, and maybe a point that you'll end up agreeing with here is that my stance on speedrunning is it's great if it can happen organically, but if it ends up being not about anything remotely close to what the game was intended to be played, or I guess a better way to put it instead of invoking intention would just
Natural
be
gameplay
what's the
is what I'd
natural
call
and
it.
fun way to play the game, right?
Natural gameplay.
Yeah, and so if we're in a situation where we're playing a game and we're deliberately like in Half-Life 2, moving backwards and changing our camera angle and save load so we can skip dialogue. Okay, that's kind of like an interesting sideshow circus act kind of thing, but it doesn't really invoke any interesting feelings for me as a player or as a designer. I wouldn't imagine it would be fun to make a game that where that's the goal of doing those inputs and with that visual and all this sort of thing. It's not a satisfactory experience because of itself. It's almost like a novelty because you're breaking the game in a certain way to achieve some high time or something, right? And so
it's a meta game actually outside the original design of the game. A really common example of this that I bring up is Ocarina of Time speedrunning, where what happens with speedrunning, and a lot of people, there's things about speedrunning that are cool, but there's also things that I'm critical about because, like you said, certain things in speedrunning will not actually capture what the game is what its strengths are. So like in Ninja Gaiden, the strength of that game, the newer ones, is like combat and fighting the enemies and the risk rewards and all that. But speedrunning it, avoiding enemies is always best. And then also just spamming like special moves is always best. So the speedrun ends up being incredibly boring because it's solved. What you do is you run through the game, avoid encounters, and then when you have to do encounters, you do spells or UT spam. And you're losing like 90% of what makes the game good. So why even bother? And with the glitch manipulation stuff, like Ocarina of Time, if you sat down and talked to a speedrunner about what makes Ocarina of Time a fun game, puzzle solving and traversing the dungeons, but Ocarina of Time speedrunning has become like manipulating these really esoteric problems in the code where you're falling through the ground and skipping through half the game in 5 minutes and stuff like that. And what ends up happening is because speedrunning is a meta game on top of the original game, what speedrunners constantly have to do over and over and over, you'll see this in all their speedrunning history videos, is the meta game will start to diverge from the main point of the game. And then speedrunners have to make up like random rules to stop that. Like, okay, we're going to do Ocarina of Time, but we're not having major glitches. No major glitch. So you can't fall through the floor into the end of the game, but you can still like clip through a wall here or there. Like you can, and it's all what's a major glitch, which is a minor glitch. And it's all very like, yeah, whatever. We'll just kind of think as we go type of thing. Whereas what I really respect about arcade games, and I'm sure strategy guys can also respect this, is what I call like formal design. Where an arcade game, there is no committee online where you look to and say, is this good or not good? Is this allowed or not allowed? If the score goes up, it's good. If the score is getting higher, you are doing something right. Whether the game wants you to do that or not, that is the metric of performance analysis. And I appreciate that design a lot more. And it's funny, speedrunners are slowly starting to say this. Even like the Devil May Cry speedrunners are like, speedrunning was more fun when developers didn't try to make games for speedrunners, when they tried to make games for like real players, and then we just did our little things on the side. Because that is more fun for speedrunners because they get a more solid product to work with. Uh, Bog will like this example. A new game came out that Bog really likes. I always say it's like something big adventure. It's like the Sonic Mania guys made it. I can't remember. It has a really stupid name, whatever the game is, but Big Blast or something like that. But it's like a 3D sort of platformer game. And already speedrunners are finding like glitched exploits, glitched movement and stuff like that undermines the fundamental version of the game. But now because speedrunning is such a thing, the developer's like, oh, I don't know if we want to fix these glitches because we'll make the speedrunners mad. It's like, yeah, but what about like the integrity of your game? What about
yes.
that?
What about the
Let the
person who isn't
speedrunners figure
trying
their
to? Yes.
Yeah, let the speedrunners figure out what they need to do. make your game as solid as possible. So
Yeah, exactly.
absolutely agree.
Yeah, and the reason I bring up speedrunning as an example is like you can say what you will. It does take some rote memorization, some mechanical timing, some precision, some skill
Oh
to pull
yeah,
off what they're doing.
absolutely.
But it's just not interesting to me, right? And you compare a lot of RTS speedruns can be the same way, funnily enough, although maybe less on the glitch side and more on the let me find a strategy that basically
Yeah,
means I don't have to
spam.
play an RTS in order to win.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
ends up being awkward because I mean, yes, there are some games where the existence of speedrunning communities can influence whether or not things get balanced or adjusted, which I do think is a bit of a problem because speedrunning is niche, despite it being, you know, maybe a widely viewed hobby or something like that. I don't
yeah.
think that the performance of the metrics or whatever of players trying to do speedrunning stuff are anywhere close to the number of people who are just going to
No,
play normally. And so it's
they're
kind of like
not.
a weird, it's like a vocal minority in that sense, and you're getting affected by the signal bias. If you're thinking as a developer, you should do that. But even beyond that, I just think catering towards a crowd that demands more skill expression, it kind of misses the boat for me because I think you can definitely have both. You can definitely have a high skill game, and you should, in my opinion. But if you're going to have playstyle expression, you've at least achieved the idea that many people can do many different things. And, you know, really, the speedrunning thing and the playstyle thing are both connected in my mind because developers have this
Absolutely.
idea that they are the sort of the buck stops with the developer. It's what I, as the developer, wanted the player to
Yes.
do. But the players don't really care about that. They take your tools and they're going to use them in ways you could never have imagined as a designer.
Yeah.
And that's happened all the time in the games that I've made or the work that I'm doing now. We've got competitive tournaments running for the project that I'm working on currently. And people are finding really clever uses and interactions that, you know, we don't have a crazy big player base, but even among that, it's still enough for people to say, make me go, and I made the unit or whatever that they're using.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's very interesting to see that process unfold. But just because they're doing something that I didn't intend or initially envision doesn't mean that I should change it so that, you know, they can't do that thing anymore. In fact, I'm very excited to see, does this break the game? Is it interesting? Because even if it feels bad in the moment to have maybe like a game trivialized because somebody abused a mechanic, it's still really compelling to me to see that whole process unfold. And I feel like designers shouldn't be thinking to themselves, yes, I am the architect. I am the only person who can pass judgment on whether something is valid. And yet that does seem to have taken over modern game design in a way. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, you can color within the lines. We'll just make the lines more expansive so you have more things to do. But in practice, everybody colors the same way. Is that sort of more or less what you were getting at with your Ghosts and Goblins video there about how, like, okay, yeah, you say you want more things that you can do as a player, but in practice, you all do the same thing. It just, you said it homogenized stuff, right?
Yeah, actually that's the point. The funny thing is that players will say, if you talk to them, you know, everywhere, they'll say, I want more I want more individuality in games. I want more uniqueness in games, and I want games that challenge me and make me like develop my skills. All people will say that, but their tastes actually don't reflect this. What most people want, game journalists especially, is they want lateral changes, but they want most games to play the same because that way they can translate their skills. So, like, if you've played 10,000 hours of Mario and then you play Ghosts and Goblins and you can't control yourself in the air, and you all the meta and all the strategy you learned in Mario does not work in Ghosts and Goblins, there's immediately that, like, this isn't, no. But if you make like Hollow Knight or like a game now where it actually or The Messenger actually plays much more like Mario than Ninja Gaiden, even though The Messenger looks like Ninja Gaiden. It has the fully controllable mechanics of Mario, the level design of Mario, but people love that. They love the kind of, they want their skill to translate from game to game. And you'll see this across game design now where you'll notice like one game introduces a mechanic and it's popular, and all the other games are like, let's do that too. So, oh, you know, Sekiro has parries and Sekiro's popping. Let's put parries in Resident Evil 4. I mean, that's hot. And so like what people want is they want to pick up a game that's kind of got some surface level differences that makes it feel unique, but its core is very similar to all the other games. So they don't have to relearn fundamental concepts like, oh, jumping is risky. I have to consider my jump, or movement is more limited. I have to consider my movement. They don't want that type of that level of uniqueness. And so that I think you'll see that a lot with games coming out now where they'll bring in mechanics that on the surface seem, oh, that's so different, but then the fundamentals will play exactly like every other game that you play. Like cameras are a great example of this. If you do anything different with a camera, people lose it. People like Resident Evil 4 and 5. I had my friend sit down and play it, and he plays more modern games. He could not, he's like, what is with this camera? I cannot do this right now. And I'm trying to explain to him, no, the camera system in this game is really good. It's really responsive, and it creates the play style of the game. He's like, I don't give a shit. I don't want to deal with this camera. You'll see that all the time where people will say they want uniqueness and changes, but what they want is just surface level aesthetic or slightly mechanical differences, but they want every game to basically play the same way.
Well, it's funny because you talked earlier about how speedrunning is a meta game on top of the existing game. And for me, there's another layer or another thing you can define as sort of like a meta game across all of gaming, which is exactly what you just said about how you want your skills to transfer. You name dropped
Legacy skills.
you name dropped games reviewers, games journalists. And what's really funny to me is that they often really don't have the expertise necessary to critique
Oh,
a
absolutely
genre
not.
that they're sort of dipping their toes in, but you won't see them acknowledge it, or if they do, it doesn't seem to factor into their score. And personally, I kind of think scores are a little bit silly because my enjoyment of a game might change depending on my mood or whatever. So really, you should just say like, do you recommend it based on X or Y? That's how I try to involve myself in it anyway, and I respond better to those kinds of recommendations too. But it's funny that the journalist class, if you want to call them that for games people, is very hell-bent on the idea, and they're kind of a mockery amongst most enthusiasts now anyway. I don't really know that many people who go to watch IGN or whatever, but
Well, the
maybe
funny thing about them, I say this on my channel all the time because it's very easy to dismiss them as a gamer because what they say is
yes,
absolute
that's
nonsense.
exactly it. Yeah.
I mean, like you can't even take them. Some of the stuff you read in these reviews is like complete nonsense in terms of, like, for example, the GameSpot or whatever it was saying like it has Ghosts and Goblins has clunky, sluggish controls. Nothing about the controls in any metric is clunky or sluggish. It's just they didn't like the style of mechanic, but they couldn't articulate that, right? Because their view is that game, like I said, game mechanics are on this evolutionary path. And so older style or like more limited styles of controls are not different style. It's like that's outdated. It's like a Windows operating system. This is Windows 98. We need to get on Windows 12 now or whatever it is. That's how same thing with all the Resident Evil 4 remake reviews that was driving me up the wall, where all the reviews are like, they fixed the camera. Like now the camera's like good. The old camera sucks and the new camera's good. They could never put together that the camera changes everything and that creates a distinctive style of play. But the thing about journalists, though, I do take them really seriously because they have this really nice option select where if you're a hardcore enthusiast gamer type, everyone on this channel is, right?
Pretty
Because
much.
we're the no frauds channel. So
Yes. Yeah.
all of us legit gamers, you read their reviews and opinions, it's absurd. But the thing is that they actually still have massive amounts of market influence. And you don't remember that until you start hanging around more casual people and you realize what IGN says, as stupid as it is like incredibly influential. And they set the tone for everyone else. So like IGN will come out and say, this game's a masterpiece. And then everyone else is like, all the casual sphere, like, well, IGN says masterpiece. And you'll see it. They'll all sort of fall in line. And if IGN comes out and says Wanted Dead's a piece of shit, everyone's like, well, I guess IGN said it. Like the reviewer class, they like stick together. They're like this union. And so they actually have a lot. It's ridiculous how stupid they are versus how much influence they have over the market and over like the economics of gaming. So actually the one reviewer that I really pay attention to is IGN. Like whenever I'm looking at stuff, but not for their opinions. Not like I'm doing like a meta read of IGN where I don't read them to actually see what they think, but like how is what they are saying going to affect the marketing and tone around the game? And it is once you start paying attention, you can see the effects of it. Like if a game comes out, IGN gives it the stamp, it's got the stamp. You'll see then all the other reviewers follow along. It's insane. And it actually, and I know like YouTubers and us independent types, we think we're immune to this and we're like, oh yeah, like those shills at IGN, they give shitty games high scores because they're shills, but us YouTubers, we don't do that shit. Yeah, you do. Because what happens is IGN's opinions and like the main market opinions, they trickle into the Twitter sphere and they trickle into the YouTuber sphere and then creates a lot of peer pressure among YouTubers and Twitter people too to go along with that. It's
Or at least pay
like
attention to
with
the product, right? Like it
yeah,
increases the
like
mind share, if you
look at
will.
the Wanted Dead stuff. Like
Hmm.
IGN Wanted Dead blows, and then all the reviewers are agreeing, and then it happens in the YouTube sphere too, where they're like, this is meme and all that kind of stuff. It's actually really rare to see IGN like shit talk something, or like the main reviewer shit talk something, and then the YouTube sphere be like, no. That's not usually what happens. Everyone kind of falls in line, and so yeah, only hipsters are really if you want real opinions, you do have to go to like those random ass hipsters who will give you what's what.
Hey, and I try to look the part every day so people know they can come to me
Yes,
and pop on
exactly.
in. They see that weird guy with the long hair, they're like, "Who is this guy?" So I'll tell you
Yeah.
what I think though is that the meta game that we were talking about with the view as it retains to the viewers is that the transferable skills, the legacy skills, there's a lot of pressure then to like basically the reviewers or whoever happens to have influence are kind of divining the parameters of what the like
Mhm.
what can be a game even or what can be a
Yes.
mechanic in a game,
Yeah.
and then from there it's like, oh, you strayed too far from it, well, that's no good. You strayed a little bit, but in some ways it's like easy to, maybe you did a really good job tutorializing it or something. Well, instead of it being like the same thing but just explained better, we're going to call it, this is a great new innovation or something. Maybe that becomes like the new thing,
Oh
or at the
yeah.
very least
And
it's
there's
like a
like
novelty, right?
there becomes like secret, like unspoken rules of game design that you'll get. For example, checkpoints. So if IGN complains about your game having too long of a checkpoint, you just set your watch and just wait, because the update patch, those checkpoints are going to get patched every time. Or like so like with Wanted Dead, they finally did an update, and you can tell they literally went through IGN's complaints and they're like, okay, the game's too hard, let's make it easier. Oh, there isn't enough health, let's give them more health. Oh, the checkpoints are too long, let's make the checkpoints easier. So they've fucked up the game, and I us hipsters can be like, oh, we like this and that and this. They're not listening to us. They don't give a shit, because we don't drive the market, and it's I do have a sympathy for developers though, because it puts them in a really tough position where back in the arcade days, or like even early console days, the game shipped. So if you send out some crazy ass game with kind of things and people are bitching about it, even if you can't like go and patch everyone's cartridges or old discs and be like, oh, we fixed this or whatever. But now, because there's that button right there, you can just be like, let's really try to turn this around. Let's, okay, we're going to patch it. It's very interesting because patching can be really good in certain situations, but it's also, I think, can lead to some really rash decisions and really screw over something that if they just held in there, it will be appreciated a little bit more.
And I think that's probably true about Wanted Dead and a number of other titles too. Is like there's, in a way, even though I really disagree with a lot of what like the core around Dark Souls as a game, like in terms of gameplay, I really find it to be quite far from the mark of what I would want. It did kind of make dying in video games cool again. It kind of made it so that,
Oh
oh yeah, I
yeah.
can lose in a game, and it's like kind of the
We
point,
can't yeah. We can't let the game journalists ruin Dark Souls for us. It because they make it an awful cliche.
Oh yeah,
And
so everything's the
now
Dark Souls of this
I
genre
know.
or
And
whatever.
now
Yeah.
whenever I'm like doing a review and I'm about to say something about Dark Souls, I'm like, no,
Yeah.
But those motherfuckers. But the thing is like I would argue, maybe I'll make a video about this, that Dark Souls is like one of the few very healthy things that has happened in gaming, because it did what a lot of other games, because they're Japanese, I think, they got the balls to do it. They're like, no, fuck you. You're gonna have to fucking do these checkpoints, bitch. We don't give a fuck. And that's like, so a Western developer, they're shaking in their boots, but the Japanese have that little bit of like cultural difference there. They're like, what are these baby Americans and Western people crying about or
They
whatever?
probably can't even read what we're saying
Or they
anyway.
don't
So
read it. Yeah.
yeah,
They also don't read
it
what
doesn't
we say
engage.
anyway.
Yeah,
They don't give a shit.
right.
So I would say, yeah, the Dark Souls series, I don't think everything's great about it, but it did bring a lot of fundamentals and a lot of like core game design back into being trendy. And now it's really funny with like reviewers and with like tastemakers. The relationship is reversed, where in other art forms during their heyday, like critics created taste. Critics created like, oh, they would recognize things that the average player and audience couldn't, and then help negotiate that and elevate the taste. Not That's never happened in video games, but in other art forms. But in video games, it's actually reversed. What happens is critics watch the players and what's popular, and then they get their opinions from that. So like when Dark Souls comes out, critics are going to be like, what is this outdated old janky bullshit? But because it becomes a thing and because it starts to grow and public word of mouth and people start to appreciate it, then the journalists are like, oh no, I guess this is good. So then right, you can see this. A funny example of this was God Hand. God Hand came out, got absolutely obliterated by critics as a giant piece of shit. And then years later, of course, like the hardcore gaming audience has really understood how amazing God Hand is. And then IGN a few years ago were like, okay, we're kind of wrong about God Hand. It's awesome. And yeah, sorry about that.
What we missed about God Hand, what the
Yeah, exactly
hidden
that
design.
Yeah.
But
What it's showing is that the critics that we have now are not tastemakers in like a good sense. They just fall back and kind of watch what everyone else is saying, and then they kind of vocalize that, and that's your review, basically. So they always miss trends, is my point. They always miss like great trends in gaming because they're always reacting rather than predicting.
Yeah, and so they have to react to it sort of already taking off before they can really do anything.
They have to jump in when it's hot. You know what I mean? It's like I can't think of like like MTV or something like that. Where back in the past, like these trendy things, they would watch for something to be trendy, and then they'll be, oh, we're part of the trend now. But none of them are actually like making the trend. They just jump on what's popular.
Well, yeah, and part of that is also because of those really thickly defined parameters, right? It's like, oh, that game's like way outside what we conceive of as a game, as a reviewer class. Yeah, right. I can't just like resume from when I Alt F4 to go get a coffee at Starbucks or whatever. Like whatever. I say Alt F4, they're probably on a controller anyway. So and it's like it's awkward for the designer then to come in and be like, wait, so I have to make a game, and if it's not within like the paradigm that's already shaped or reinforced perhaps by these people, then I have to like get a really good word of mouth hit so that tide turns on the reviewers so that maybe I can snowball that, right?
That's exactly what you have to do. And it is real. That's why I say I have a lot of sympathy for developers. Right. Another example of this was a developer. These are arcade examples, so I'm sorry if your audience doesn't, connect.
A lot of them, there's actually a lot of overlap between RTS and arcade, I think, at least in my crew. So I'm sure they'll get it.
Okay, cool. So a beat 'em up came out recently, a few years ago, called Final Vendetta. It's a really solid beat 'em up. It's not like groundbreaking or anything, but it's really solid. But my favorite thing about it, one of my favorite things about it was it required the player to do a 1cc. It like forced you. It wouldn't let you continue. So if you game overed, you'd have to redo it. And I was like, oh, this is really bold and this is really cool. And every review complained about it. And then the developer patched it out.
Oh,
the developer's like, no, we were just kidding, guys.
That's pretty.
But you know what? Yeah. But the funny thing is, if they sent me that, I'm like, this is bold. I really like this, and this is like helping teach the player, like like what Dark Souls did. It's like helping teach the player the meta of skill progression and like punishment. I thought it was a great move, but they got pressured. Ultimately, it's their decision to cave or not. But yeah, I mean, the pressure was on. I mean, it's just Steam reviews, every single review of the game except mine. They're like, this is bull crap. No 1cc shouldn't be forced. You should let players, credit feed through. So,
what's so funny is that my argument, and maybe I won't sell any games, we'll see. But my argument would be, hey, you go play a different game if you want to do that. This is how we do things in this game, right? Like, I feel like more developers need to do that, but there is a vested interest against doing that, right?
There is. I think it's like a short-term versus long-term thing. YouTubing's like this as well, where like I was critical of Bayonetta 3 the day it came out. And, whenever a game comes out, I say one of the most dangerous things to do as a YouTuber is to stand in front of the hype train because it will run your ass over. So like whenever like a really popular game comes out, it's very tricky because you don't want to just be a contrarian for the sake of it, but you're just trying to be accurate, right? So I thought Bayonetta 3 blew. It was I think it sucks. It's a huge step down from the other games, especially Bayo 1. And I was very critical of it. And so when the game came out, I got like ran over by the Nintendo and the internet. Just like, who's this motherfucker? Oh, he's just being a contrarian, this and that. I had like larger YouTubers. A funny little thing, you might know this, is like when a larger YouTuber comments on your video, YouTube sends you like a special notification like, oh, someone really famous wants to talk to you. And usually that's like, oh, that's so exciting. And I remember when I did my Bayonetta 3 review, I would get those and I'd be like, oh, what did they say? And then they're just like shit talking me, like, fuck you, mother, grow up, stop being a baby. I'm like, all right. Yeah. But anyway, now that time has moved on, everyone looks back at Bayo 3 now, and it's pretty much now everyone's like, okay, yeah, Bayonetta 3 does suck. We all agree now.
Yeah.
But but that window of when it matters is really scary because the internet is going to run you over with a train. So as a developer, you release your game and there's something like that in there, something that's pushing against mainstream taste. The pressure is going to be really hard for developers not to cave into. It's going to be really hard. It's going to feel like, what are you even achieving here? Because the people who like it are either a minority like myself, or they don't care enough to not buy your game, right? So like they got rid of the 1cc forced requirement. Am I going to refund the game because of that? No, I'm just going to be kind of bummed. But so it's like every force on the internet, if you're a developer or a YouTuber or do anything, every force is trying to get you into that sort of mainstream, popular, lowest common denominator lane. Everything is going to push you that direction. Your fans, career opportunities, your peers, even like everyone's going to push you towards that direction. So I always really appreciate when developers and YouTubers have the balls to be like, no, I don't care if you guys are pissed. And you might really suffer sales wise. That's the tough thing. It's like, it's one thing to say, oh, you won't, but you actually might.
And you know what? Here's where we can talk. I guess what the we've eaten the appetizer, right? It was some nice, like whatever you want to call it, some bread with some seasoning on it. You dip it in nicely. Here's
keep me under control.
No, here's the steak.
Me in my line.
Here's the steak. So difficulty, right? For me, the biggest deal about any game is, am I being challenged enough to continue playing? And that sounds weird to, I guess, most people who are maybe more on the casual side. But I need to know that my opponents in a game are actually trying to beat me. They have their own goals and conditions. And I think it deviates a little bit from the arcade understanding in some ways, where I actually really do like to get immersed in a world. And I find that so impossible in most video games because I look at what the enemy is doing in a game, and especially in an RTS sense. I mean, single player campaigns are pretty bad for this. You walk through and you're like, you open the map in the editor, or you just like look around the map in game, and it's like, wait, you had control of the whole map. And you had like 300 supply worth of units, so you could have moved me with at the start of the game, and you didn't. Well, there goes my immersion immediately. Like I can't get invested in this. And then the dialogue will say, "Oh, Zeratul is really strong, dude. He's a tough guy. Watch out for Amon. He's like a really powerful dude." Like, no, dude. Like these guys are jokes, even on the highest difficulty or whatever. So you can kind of tell that, and that somewhat is down to your player's skill, but it's also just down to like how you construct the levels. And for me, we talk a lot about so far like meta games on top of a game. I kind of see video games as this vector for a way to see that challenges can be overcome. And it's like teaching you that meta skill, which goes well beyond just video games. And in a way, I feel like it can actually, like, everybody sees video games as almost like a little bit trashy, a little bit like, it's just a time waster. But no, I mean, I've learned a lot of skills from banging my head against a wall of competitive games time and time again that like, okay, now I cooperation with other players so that I can keep playing against them to get better, and, studying my own mistakes so I can be introspective and improve. And like, these are things that it doesn't really matter if you're playing a game or just dealing with, people at work or whatever. There's going to be times and areas where you can use these skills. So the fact that you're learning them within the context of a game seems like it's a perfectly valid use of your time, as opposed to it being conceived of as a waste of time, which is maybe true for the more casual games. And so to bring it all back on the case of difficulty, like in my games, the tutorials are going to be able to defeat you, and probably will defeat you, because actually what I'm teaching you, in addition to how to play the game, is how to lose at the game and then improve based on that.
Yeah,
and so, like,
I love that.
One of the things that you cover in the most recent video that you did that we brought up at the beginning about Ghosts and Goblins is that there's certain details that you can really only learn if you've died to them already, or at least they've already happened and you've analyzed them, right? And while I can see and understand why some people would think of that as being really frustrating, I think if you don't know to expect that behavior, like, the burrito enemy, for example, the way that it like has all these nuances and stuff.
Yeah, lifts and throws spears. You're like, what
right. Yeah, and so figuring out what the parameters are for when that enemy will do a certain thing is kind of like, you could make an analogy to, okay, what time does my enemy attack me in this level? And it's like, oh, the first attack comes at like 3 minutes in. Okay, well, that means I'm going to try to prepare for that. And, it can attack from the right or the left, so I should scout to figure out where he's attacking from. Like, details that, like, you can learn, even if you learn by dying the first couple of times. And in the RTS, this is like, This is me standing on an island, and like nobody agrees with me initially, and like
Oh, I agree
everybody's
with you
like,
completely.
well, sure, yeah. I just mean like within the RTS sphere.
Here's
Go
something
ahead.
you can throw out the RTS. So I'm gonna switch to your I'm gonna code switch to the RTS
Okay,
language.
hit me.
Speak to your audience here. Okay, so the first thing is if you talk to RTS players, and I do have a love and fondness for Brood War. I don't know if that's like lame at this point or still cool. I don't know where it lands in the. I'll stand by Brood War, whether it's
There it
cool or
is.
not cool. I fucking
There it
love that
is.
game. And in terms of real life skills, it did help me in my real life career because my fucking typing skills playing Brood War. I go to work, I'm like, I still work. I work with a bunch of old boomers, and I have like a mechanical keyboard, and they're like, "What's that for?" I'm like, "Check out this APM." I'm like,
Yeah.
typing up
There it
emails
is.
100 miles an hour.
There it is.
But the thing about it here, you can talk to your audience in their language about is if you ask RTS players, are RTS a genre of skill? Is playing these games competitively skill based or not? I'm pretty sure most people would say yes. Obviously, it's a game of skill. Well, if it's a game of skill, then in order to learn and improve in skill, loss is a natural part of that process. Imagine if you were a competitive tennis player and you expected the first tennis match you play, you have to win. And if you don't win that tennis match, that means there's something wrong with tennis. Like tennis itself is flawed because you didn't win that first match. Or even musical instruments. Imagine if someone had the expectation the first time you sit down to play a piano, you will never hit a note incorrectly. That won't happen. You will just nail it the first time. And if you don't, there's something wrong with pianos. So, failure is a natural part of the game design, and it's an important part. And this whole concept that you shouldn't fail at the game, even in the tutorial, I highly disagree with because you can't improve if you don't fail. Like, it's literally impossible. You'll just be stuck on this, what we have now, this just very basic, pathetic, easy mode situation because anything that requires skill requires failure and improvement. It just is natural. It is inborn into the process. And another thing that I say on my channel that I think will connect with what you're saying here is that when people talk about difficulty, they often talk about difficulty as just this weird version of playing a game. Like, oh, you're one of those guys who plays the game on a hard mode just for the hell of it. But I always say that difficulty is content. Like literal difficulty is content. So if you make an RTS that's easy and the single player isn't challenging, you could have 5,000 levels of that. You are missing the real content because the real content is the challenge of fighting the game systems. So you could have 10,000 level campaign, but if they're all easy, that is incomplete. There is not the content is just whatever, it's not real. The depth and replayability, difficulty is the fuel for that. If there's no difficulty, it's like driving a car with no gas. You need it to fuel the design of the game. Difficulty is the gasoline for game design. So that's something I say on my channel all the time. And so I'm one of the few people, there's some reviews of it, where if the game's too easy, I will say, this game is too easy. That is a problem. They need to add a hard mode. Like literally, this is required content. We need a hard mode of this game because otherwise its design is flaccid. You can't, there's not depth, there's not replayability. If I can cruise through the game the first time, there's not what am I supposed to do? There's even if I want to make up my own little challenges or whatever, you're missing that content. So I always say that difficulty is content, literally.
And not only that, but like I go the other way and say there's no difficulty selection in my games. There's nothing planned for that. So if you can't beat the tutorial, well, practice until you can, right? Try until you can.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to lock out
Dark
the rest
Souls
of the
again.
game.
Dark
Yeah.
Souls again.
I won't lock out your ability to play multiplayer or arcade games or whatever if you want to do that. But like the idea is, go through the tutorial if you want to play, the other single player stuff, you want to get further in. My hope is that by pitching also like an interesting world and characters and like making you like one of the things that I do is the tutorial for the first race is like it's basically just humans. And so you have this guy shouting at you as like a drill sergeant type character. And the idea is based on the dialogue, you want to beat this guy. Like he's a loudmouth, he shit talks you in the middle of the the game.
Yeah.
He says that you're not doing, like, you're wasting his time, and
You fail.
Yeah. And if, like, there's certain breakpoints that we're going to add as well, where it's like, oh, you didn't even kill a single one of his units or something, like a really embarrassing loss or something, then he's going to comment on that differently than if it's like a closer game or whatever. And so, like, little things like that.
Really good game design. Fundamentally, I was talking to Boghawk about this yesterday. There is one flaw that I wish I would have brought up in Ghosts and Goblins, but I didn't realize it until yesterday, which is that one problem that Ghosts and Goblins has, it's not necessarily the core game design, but I think the way it presents itself a little too passively, because what can happen is if you present a game that's really hard and really challenging and present it as like really passive, like, oh, this is just like Mario, except you get annihilated in 3 seconds, but the game's all smiley and happy about it. What happens is you're not sending that signal to the player that you are acknowledging that this is intentional. So like a lot of really great, like a lot of games that are known now for being difficult, Dark Souls reference incoming, is that they actually communicate this to the player formally, and the player understands this. Like when you die in Dark Souls, like, you died.
Yes,
it's
big
like,
bold letters.
Shame on you.
Yeah.
And then it makes you run back to where you died just to rub your nose in it. Like, oh,
and if you die a second time, it's even worse. Yeah.
Yeah, go back to that cliff and get your shit, player.
Yeah.
So like the game is communicating to that. There's another like really funny example of it in Ninja Gaiden, the arcade version. When you have the game over screen, Ryu has this like blade coming down that's gonna chop him in half. Like, and then shmups, a lot of shmups have this too. It's like, you failed, and like big letters and stuff like that. Yeah, all those types of things. If you can communicate to the player through your story or through your what's appearing on screen that the game's hard and that the game is like pushing you to accept its challenge, I think that is effective. So having the drill sergeant be like, dude, you suck, dude. You didn't even kill one unit. What's wrong with you? I actually do think that is effective design.
Yeah, I mean, even the sort of advisor / like robot assistant that you have says this operation is a failure if you lose all your stuff. And so like even little things like that, you want the player to not like that. You want the player to be uncomfortable by that, because otherwise they're never going to change their behavior and be better at the game, right? And so that's also about driving improvement. So anyway, not necessarily just to talk about my own stuff all the time, but the point of me bringing it up is, I mean, I would bring up something else if I could, but I haven't played an RTS where the tutorial is actually teaching me the valuable skill of failing in order to get better and understanding. Even like the other thing is, okay, maybe you're an established RTS player. Maybe you've already played RTS. Maybe you play them all the time. You don't need a tutorial to tell you, okay, I have to lose at the game in order to be better. But you might need to see what a good player, in air quotes good, actually does in the game to be successful.
Yeah,
and so the tutorial opponent having a meta composition of units and having strategies that look like, well, it's constantly making workers, it's constantly expanding its economy, it's constantly sending more units to attack and building more structures to train more units, and all this stuff, like basically engaging in the core gameplay. If the AI opponent does that, even in the tutorial, that is also teaching you what you might be able to do better. And so you can go back and watch the replay of that or whatever, and learn that way. And so even if you don't need the lesson on, okay, I should, fail in order to learn, you still need to know what you're supposed to be learning. And so it kind of accomplishes it for the veteran and for the newbie, in my opinion. And yet again, I feel like arcades are probably like, maybe I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, because obviously you exist in that space, and that those kinds of games do kind of handle that, especially in their design language. And again, like you failed and all this other stuff. It's much more obvious, but it feels like, especially with the direction modern RTS games have gone, there's not really much an acknowledgement of any of this. And it's almost like they exist in two different states at once, or at least two different states. So Stormgate is a game that's been coming out lately that's now in the alpha or beta stage or whatever they're calling it now. And aside from a bunch of other concerns about the game that I have, one of the things is that they are segregating out the casual player base from the competitive player base by saying, okay, you want 1v1? Well, here's your hardcore mode. It's just 1v1.
Yes.
And then here, you want your casual game? Well, here's co-op and you play with 3 buddies or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's great. But if you're playing fundamentally different games, like the whole game state is different and like the AI doesn't use the map or use the mechanics. And it's like in StarCraft 2's co-op, I don't know if you've ever played it, but it's literally just like the AI spawns in units and doesn't actually engage with the RTS mechanics. And so you're not learning transferable skills between the different modes. And so what happens is you get all of the people culminating in one spot that they prefer, one niche, But if that niche is ever better served by another game later, like a more fun co-op game, well, the co-op players are gone. A better 1v1 game, the 1v1 players are gone, because you haven't actually bridged the gap and had this like healthy interplay. The only people who are going to do both are maybe people who have friend groups that do both, or people who are naturally just like fine with either one. And that doesn't describe a majority or a plurality of the people who are playing these kinds of games. And it's just weird to me to see like RTS in particular. It would be like if arcade games started as a whole body started pivoting towards casuals and not really listening to the hardcore, right? And it's like, it's very confusing. So yeah, talk to me about that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because the issue that comes up is what the developers are doing now is they are trying to thread this needle of fighting games do this all the time too, where they're like trying to bring in casual players, and the way they think the best way to bring in casual players is to dumb down the mechanics of the game, to dumb down the AI, to dumb down the difficulty. And they think that this is a great way to bring in new players because they're not going to have that frustration period. They're not going to have that struggle period. They're going to have a lot more transferable skills between games. So they can fire up the game on the weekend, play it for 4 hours, pass the Steam refund point, and then we're good. But the thing about that is that what a lot of people don't discuss is if you start removing these elements, you are literally removing the game. It's not that you have a different mode of the game, it is a different game. So you're just sticking two games together with duct tape and like, hey, here's this game and here's that game. And you'll get that divided audience that isn't going to transfer between them because they are different games. They are not the same game. If you start taking out the core fundamental aspects of these design, yeah, we're seeing this across the board in a lot of stuff now. A really obnoxious one in action games is they'll make the campaigns kind of like, this immersive story type of thing. So they'll put in a Bayonetta 3 is guilty of this big time, like big cinematic sections where you just press A, and like sections where you just walk through, or section bosses that are dead easy. So then they get the whole like mainstream crowd to play the campaign for 3 hours. But then they're like, oh yeah, we spent a lot of time and budget on that, and we kind of forgot like the main difficulty and all that balance. So we'll give you like a mode. So then, and the annoying part is like hardcore players will accept scraps now. So it's like, okay, it used to be that campaigns were fully realized and had a lot of shit, like that was the game. And now the game is like this little mode that you play on the side, like Mercs mode or something. Like, well, you got Mercs mode. Yeah, but what about the campaign? So yeah, I could see that happening a lot. Any game that's competitive or any game that's really hardcore, they're starting to do this with. And yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the approach at all. I don't think it accomplishes what they're trying to accomplish. This naive idea that people are going to play this dumbed down version of the game and then immediately flip mentality and be like, yeah, no, I'm going to now be absolutely punished to death in the other game. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, and describing it as two separate games glued together is really a good way to underscore it. And another example, we talked a little bit about Warcraft 3 before we started this.
Yes.
And Warcraft 3 has obviously this big like idea of everybody thinks it's a successful RTS. In my opinion, it was more successful as a platform for a custom map, which was, of course, Defense of the Ancients, Dota. That started the whole MOBA craze, or continued it
MOBA,
anyway. Yeah. And it's like, I feel like people wouldn't have left the 1v1 and general team play and melee and stuff of Warcraft 3 in droves for a custom map if the core game of the 1v1 was actually that satisfying. And so you also run the risk of potentially making one of the two game, like obviously it's not like Dota is the custom map of Dota isn't really analogous to anything in StarCraft 2 or in Stormgate, but the idea of like different modes or different things that become part of the game as far as core player base is concerned is like they are two fundamentally different things. And so you run the risk of basically repeating those mistakes where, okay, you're going to have this mode where all of these other players flock to, and they're not going to be interested in the competitive side and vice versa, right? The competitive players bought the game and played the game because they wanted to play the game. And now there's this other game on top of it. And it does divide your resources, it divides your attention, it divides your player base. I think it's fine to have offerings for different ones, but if you're not teaching the same core skills, like one of the things I've learned even with a very small player base that we have here, where it's about like 100 people probably, and not all of them are competitive, some of them are just single player. It feels like just looking at that and studying it as grown, you see people who are interested in taking the plunge into multiplayer, and it's in large part because they experienced what multiplayer is, some part of what multiplayer is in single player content already. And, you know, again, that's a test case that's very limited and very, you know, okay, maybe you can say it's anecdotal because it's not like, you know, a big game in terms of player base. But I feel like that principle will hold true. And it's certainly the inverse has held true in all of these other test cases. And I don't know why people are making the same mistakes, but I guess it comes back to what we were talking about with the reviewers and shaping the tastes and stuff, right?
Exactly. I was going to add to that point where what you don't want to see happening in single player content, and we see it a lot across many genres, is you don't want to teach the single player players a false understanding of the game.
Absolutely.
So that when they think they know it, they think, oh, this works. And then they go to play competitively and like, you need to learn a whole new game again. That I call this, I made a video about this with Tekken. I called it the scrub sand trap. Tekken is really guilty of this, where like the single player content, the AI can't even Korean backdash. So the AI can't even do like fundamental things that you need to do in Tekken competitively. And the AI plays in a style of gameplay that's more about like blocking and throwing strings and abusing mids. And if you do that, you can obliterate the AI. You can obliterate Tekken. So I spent years learning to play Tekken like this. Just you know, mids, strings, mids, strings. And then when you go to play online, players still think that style of gameplay works. And so the lower ranks of Tekken are just littered with dudes spamming strings, mids, never sidestepping, never doing like the more fundamental aspects of the gameplay. And then once you get to a certain rank, you just are stuck. I call it the scrub sand trap. You can't because that meta game doesn't work once you bring in more of the true meta fundamentals of the game. You just get stuck. So then I had to do this. I had to double back and relearn the entire game again to play it properly. And one of the game to contrast that, a game that does it much better is Virtua Fighter. Virtua Fighter 5 single player is so close to the meta of the competitive game. It teaches you like sidestepping, option selecting throws, teaches you like fuzzy guarding. Like the tutorial literally teaches you these things. There's fuzzy guarding tutorials in Tekken 5 or Virtua Fighter 5. And so when I was playing Virtua Fighter, I spent hundreds of hours practicing against the AI. And then I went to play online and a lot of those skills transferred. And I was like, I've never experienced this in a fighting game before. It's always been you learn to play the game against the computer and then you relearn it to play against real people. Virtua Fighter was the one time where it's like it transferred, and that was really mind-opening to me. And I'm sure with RTS players, I really like where you're going with like you make the enemy AI as analogous to the actual meta of the game as possible and teach the players that meta in that contained single player environment. And I think that will actually make your multiplayer much more popular because it's really scary and overwhelming for a new player to come in and just go into ranked matches with no idea how the meta is played and just get annihilated over and over and over and over. And of course, online, no one's going to teach you shit. They're going to, if you do have any weaknesses, they're going to exploit it to the maximum amount. So you're just going to get obliterated until you figure it out on your own. But if the single player is not giving you the tools to figure it out on your own, you're just fucked. And so I really agree with this. Like making the single player content as analogous and informative about the competitive play is possible. I think that does lead to our more robust multiplayer competitive scene. I've seen it in fighting games. You see it in FPS games. I think it would hopefully hold true the same in RTS games as well.
It's really nice to hear that it has been done before, and even in other genres. Because again, I've been looking high and low, played so many RTS games from obscure to popular, and yet so many of them, or pretty much all of them, like the closest thing that I've seen to a meta teaching tutorial is stuff that they added in one of the Age of Empires 2 remakes, where they have these like ways to like you're basically competing in the economic standpoint. You're like for the opening, you basically like a build order teacher, but in a way where you're harvesting resources, and you're doing it. Can you beat the timing of the AI enemy that's just doing that? So there's not really combat pressure, but you're trying to like race it. And that's kind of an interesting thing. It's like you could imagine a macro tutorial in any RTS game where it's like, can you get to a higher resource count count than the enemy, than your competitor, and they're not fighting. It's
Yeah.
just that stripped down, and so that can be useful as like a drill sort of thing. Like, oh, I'm going to practice my macro and stuff, see how fast I can get to a certain level, and then you always have like this objective, like consistent, I guess, thing to compare yourself to. Is like, okay, am I doing as well as the enemy, or even if I'm doing better than the enemy, am I doing as better as I was? Like, am I getting my high score or whatever? Right? And just like to practice that can be helpful at the very least to see, like, at least you can just look at the guy and see what he's doing, right? And so that's pretty helpful. But that's the only time I've seen anything that comes close to what you're talking about. And on top of it all, I mean, that's a smaller game, right? And so you don't necessarily know if it's even like, could they get to a situation where the meta becomes something else, where now it's like a different thing, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the problem with RTS games, just from a more casual perspective, is I think these genres actually really underdeveloped in terms of its single player content, because a lot of genres are not just RTS games, but because what a lot of developers do is they offload the responsibility of game design onto the competitive scene. They just offload that on you guys. And so the way it works, and this is something that fighting games really struggle with, is that can work if your game is really popular. So if you StarCraft 2 or whatever it is, like if your game's really popular, the community will actually do that work for you. They'll come in, they'll make the guides, they'll help you learn, they'll do all that for you. But if you have a smaller strategy game or a smaller fighting game, if you're not doing that as a developer, you can't get the ball rolling. It's like the smaller your competitive community is, the more you have to do as the developer to help them and guide them and give them the resources and tools that they need. Single player content's a big example of that. But what happens is indie devs look at like big mainstream developers and they're like, well, this is how they do it, so I'll do it that same way. It's like, yeah, but their rules don't apply to you. You have to abide by a different set of rules. It's like a YouTuber where if you're a big multi-million dollar subscriber YouTuber, you can do the dumbest shit ever and you'll still get views. You can call your video hi with a smiley face, and then you can put a thumbnail of like a pinky and a title and have like no video description, and it gets 5 million views because you have that power. But if you're like our channel size and you release a video called hi and you put a little pinky in your no one's watching that. People are going to think you're an idiot. So same thing with indie games. Like, you're kind of held, smaller strategy games, smaller indie games, you're held to a higher standard. You need to do more as the developer. But we're talking about modes. I wanted to add this. So I don't want to give the impression that I don't think modes are good. I think extra modes are good, but what you should do with them is, they, like that Age of Empires mode you're describing, they should feed into the natural fundamental gameplay. So if you get a mode that takes a section of the gameplay, like economics, this mode's going to really emphasize getting really good at economics, and you like the master of economics and you love that mode, that skill will then translate over to the main game, the main way the game is played. But if you take a mode and you subvert how the game is supposed to play, like you make it too easy, you make options that wouldn't work in real competitive play all of a sudden viable. Like, for example, I remember in StarCraft, to criticize StarCraft as much as I love the game, like, the enemy AI is like really chill. It's like really like, it's on ketamine or something. It's not worrying about it. So whenever I played Terran, I'm a Terran player, like, I never worried about detectors, because like the enemy AI in StarCraft like never sends invisible units to you, or super rarely, maybe like one map or two, but it never does it. It only just sends like, visible units to you. So I learned for years to do all these builds, and I never included detectors in my builds. I go to play online and dude's like fucking nuking me and like Dark Templar destroy. I'm like, what the fuck? Because I didn't have any. And then I was like, how do I stop this? And so then I'm like, oh, I'll just build a detector. And they come in and blow up the detector. I'm like, what am I do now? Like, I never learned the detector meta of that game because the single player content never challenged that skill. So that's a failure of the single player design. And I'm sure there's many more examples in strategy games you can think of, but you don't want, if you don't, yeah, if you mislead the player on what options are viable and what aren't, you're going to get that cutoff with the competitive players where if a dude's been playing StarCraft like myself for decades in single player mode, or a decade, however long it's been, and then you go and play online and like all your strategies in single player mode don't work, you're not going to be like, all right, let me relearn the entire game. You're just be like, oh, whatever, I'll just go back to single player mode.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that obviously impinges on it. I mean, there's all. I honestly think that there's certain aspects that people say that are also a bit overstated. Like I hear about ladder anxiety a lot. I also hear about like
Oh yeah,
certain
that's the thing in
social
fighting games too.
right. There's like certain social phenomenon, and I feel like maybe there is an element, and surely there must be some element of it that's latent within people, even in like a well-designed game. If we imagine the sort of superlative design game in our head, sure, there'd probably still be some people who would be like, I don't know if I want to be competitive. Like, I'm not saying you can fix it for everybody, but I feel like the vast majority of those kinds of things, or like another one is like, oh, I don't want to play 1v1 because I can't blame my teammates if I lose, right? It's like, well, I don't know. I
Yeah.
feel like you could probably convince a lot more people to play it if they felt more comfortable. And the reason they don't feel comfortable is because of exactly what you're saying. They haven't been trained to lose in the first place, and they haven't been trained in what even the meta looks like, or what something that would at least give them a leg up and come up with their own free form. Like, I personally look at, I watch a lot of Brood War competitive play, and a lot of it is kind of mapped out where like they'll get the casters get excited if you build like one extra production structure at this time, or like you pretend you're making this unit, but actually you're making like that unit like 30 seconds later. That's the idea of like innovation. Like, oh my god, what he's skipping on this and being greedy. And sure, there's an element of glory to that, or there's an element of things where that's really cool. But I feel like what you could really see, like again, you talked about the single player content not being mapped out. I kind of feel the same thing about the competitive stuff too, because they have existed within the paradigm of what something you brought up earlier is like, oh, you have these tools at your disposal, and if you don't use them the right way, then you're stupid. And that's kind of like how the metas develop at a high level. And in some ways that's true, but I envision a world where the decision tree is a lot more rich. And yes, you still have trade-offs. So one of the criticisms that you levied at some of those, like the mode switching, the style switching in DMC3 when they modded it back in from 4 is like, okay, now there's no trade-offs to doing this, and so you're just going to go with the more optimal thing. I think the idea would be you start on a decision tree, and it doesn't follow you through the whole game, because maybe the whole game is like an hour and you don't want to be like paying for your choices in that particular respect. Like, oh, I made an upgrade for bio, so I can't make mech. Like, I feel like that's a little stupid. And it's like, I'm sort of positioned away from making mech because I've upgraded my bio. But if it's instead like I built a bio production structure and now I want mech, I'm going to add a mech production structure. That feels a bit better from the standpoint of choice and that. And there still is trade-offs, because you can't make mech out of the biostructure, right? And so if you want to switch, you have to put in the infrastructure. And I feel like something like that goes a lot way
down
better.
to risk. It comes down to risk reward is the key. Risk reward.
Yeah.
So like, I might be talking out of my ass here because I'm not as good at strategy or as familiar with strategy games, but I have played a lot of Brood War at least. But like, the idea would be like you're early in a match and you're like, okay, I'm going to go with a bio build here. I think that's what we're going with. And then you get like halfway through the match and you're like, I shouldn't have done that. That was a bad idea. So a great game would be that there is enough room there to adjust and be like, okay, we got to get the mechs going, but there's a cost. That's what you want. You want there to be a cost, and that actually creates skill opportunities. Because like, let's say there is no cost. Let's say you're going along, you did the bio build, and then you scout and you're like, actually, I should have gone with mech. And then you just go and press a button and you switch over to mech. What skill is that? Then there's no room for skill expression, and there's no room for even like as a player to see like different decision trees. But if you make the game have trade-offs so that the guy goes and he scouts, he's like, oh shit, I should have not done the bio build. And then you see the dude like scrambling his economy, scrambling his structures, like moving shit around and like having to make all of these adjustments to make up for that mistake. And then he ends up winning the match because he was able to pull it together. You can see, oh, that is a skill opportunity right there. But if there's no limitation, if there's no punishment, there's no risk, the skill opportunity doesn't exist. He can just hit a button. Oh, I guess I'll just build mechs now, and game design wise, there's no reason why that's not possible, because, you're the god of the game. You can decide as the designer, you can decide, well, if you press a button, you get bio. If you press another button, you get mech. But if you don't, so, it's down to you to create those risks and rewards. It's down to you to create those restrictions. And players sometimes are stupid in how games should be designed because they only see it from their perspective. So they don't understand what they even like. I say this all the time. Players don't understand what they even like, because the player thinks when he sees that he fucked up and he did the bio build, in his heart, he doesn't want to lose. So at that moment, he's like, fuck, I wish I could just like switch. This whole bullshit of me having to change all this stuff, it's bullshit. But when he wins with the mech, then he's like, I did it. That he doesn't even understand what happened. He doesn't understand where that feeling comes from. That if he just could press a button and change his mistake, he wouldn't feel that same sense of accomplishment. But players can't, in the moment, especially because you don't want to lose, you don't see all of that. You just see, I want to win by any means necessary. And so players, a lot of times, they will always advocate for like actually pretty dumb design decisions, but it makes their life easier. Like a funny example of that was there with Tekken. There was like a ridiculous moment in Tekken 7 where they made, not to get too like, because I know you guys are RTS guys, but basically they made the electric track too much. And that was like its big weak. They removed the weakness of a move, a very powerful centralizing move called the electric, and it like tracked. So, and I was a player who played that character, and I have to admit, I had a great 2 weeks fucking throwing electrics and no one can get out of it. But then what happened that made me mad is then other people started playing my character and doing that to me. And then I was like, because before, I'd played this character for years and I learned how to step it. I learned how to counter it. But now I lost that skill because the skill was removed from the game. So at first, it feels awesome when you're the one throwing electrics and no one can get out of them. You're like, this is a party. But then once you realize that other people can do it to you, and then that opportunity, that skill that you learned of stepping it and mitigating it is gone, you realize, okay, now the game sucks because now we just throw electrics at each other and you've actually removed that depth of the game. But if you ask the players that, they don't have that long-term perspective. They don't have that wide view of how the design works. They just have the right in front of me, oh, I'm going to have a fun week hitting people with electrics kind of type of thing. So
yeah, they can't see that it's an arms race into,
yes,
now whoever's going to use the OP move or whatever is just like, it's an arms race of that. Now you get mirror matchups all the time, right? Because there's no reason to play anything else. Yeah.
And what happens is like a few months later, players will all be like, okay, that was a bad idea.
Right.
But it takes time for players to come to that. Whereas you as the developer, you have to see that faster and you have to make those decisions because you don't want to get in the situation that you probably see this with RTS games. Every competitive game has this now where like the developers are always like patching shit and then something's wrong. Yeah. And they're like, oh, fuck, patch that. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, shit. And they're just like constantly patching things and like shifting things. And they have no idea what's happening anymore because they don't have that vision of no risk reward. We need risk and reward. And if you don't have that, you don't have skill expression. You need both. And a lot of players and a lot of commentators think all you need is options. Skill is options. But if the options have no punishment, they're meaningless. It's just the same, it's just spamming the same move in the end. So yeah, hopefully that kind of translates over to your audience a little bit with like the build type of stuff.
No, I think so, because, and the main thing that I would say as it pertains to the RTS builds too is just like, yeah, it absolutely is about trade-offs. There's going to be certain things that are different depending on which race you are, because like Terran can lift their structures or whatever. But, the other races are going to have to deal with the fact that they built infrastructure that is no longer as useful. And if, I feel like that goes into scouting and figuring out what your opponent's doing and having a general understanding of stuff. The other thing that I thought was interesting you brought up is you talked about how like it doesn't feel as satisfying in the moment. They wouldn't realize it, but if it was patched so you could just switch it, or indeed in the case of the electric stuff, it's like, yeah, I'm winning all these games, but then like you realize how cheap it is, and then it loses its value. In a funny roundabout way, like obviously in StarCraft's campaign, you defeat the Overmind, which is like the god of Zerg. And
I played the campaign.
You defeat Amon, who's like a dark god or something or whatever. And it's like, a lot of it is like supposed to be like really high scale epic. And I've heard people have said that they've gotten more value or more satisfaction out of defeating my drill sergeant in a training sim than like defeating one of these like epic Titan characters. And I think it's all down to that.
Creates meaning.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a good quote.
In game design, aesthetics and lore only goes so far. I hate to tell you, RPG players, aesthetics and lore only goes so far. For example, the hardest time I've ever popped off in gaming in history, like I popped off, my heart rate, I about passed out, was the final boss of Dodonpachi. His name's Hibachi, and he is a motherfucker. He's the thing of nightmares. And this is after like it takes 50 minutes of the most hardcore, just insanity to even get to the guy. And then the guy just eviscerates you. And then you have to play 50 more minutes to get back to him. And so I I had so many runs where I died and he had like just this bit, it was like 20 seconds more he would have died. And I died physically painful. I was like, oh, I like buckled over like, why God? Why? But is there some kind of great lore behind Hibachi? The game has its cute little like, oh, he's the ultimate boss or whatever, but is there really like this great lore and his sprite is like just this flying pile of shit type of thing. It's like they had to make the sprite like a weird thing because of limitations anyway. But anyway, like on paper, there's nothing really that crazy about the boss in terms of lore or presentation or story, but the difficulty and the context in the game design, that is one of the most epic, insane bosses in all of gaming because of the context of difficulty. So imagine you're playing StarCraft Brood War or StarCraft 1, whatever one you defeat the Overmind, and that level is just fucking you up all day. You spend weeks just getting obliterated by the level, and then you go to kill the Overmind and you kill him, and then he like respawns stronger and like 50 ultralisks come out or something. Like that would give the actual player context meaning. Like the story is now supplemented in the gameplay in real meaningful way. Like difficulty creates meaning. Like I said, it's the gasoline of game design. You can have all the cutscenes and lore you want, but if the game's easy, there's no intensity. You're not going to get that same feeling no matter what you do story wise.
Well, here's a question for you, because I feel like we talked a bit about certain things that maybe are not mapped out very well so far by because I do view gaming as very much a young medium still, assuming, we're going to be around for a long while. If we can assume that, we can assume gaming is going to continue to evolve really massively. And so the thing that I look at it with is like, where are the games with the good stories? Like, do you happen to know any? Because like I'm not being facetious when I say I haven't played a game that has like a single player experience that has like actually a good story. You know what I'm saying? Like all these games, like you talked about RPG players, or you name dropped that. It's like I hate to tell you RPG players, but this, it's true though. Yes. It's like you guys have this idea.
I get myself in a lot of trouble with this.
Okay,
because I'm really critical of video game stories, and so there's certain video game stories people love and think they're like amazing. And there are some good-ish ones out there, like the Final Fantasy games, some of them have good-ish stories. But the problem with gaming stories is, in my opinion, I view gaming as more of an abstract medium than most people. Like if you talk to people who talk about video games in terms of art, what do they always compare them to? Like movies and comic books and shit like that. I don't think gaming is film. And I don't think it's actually much more like music. Gaming is much more like gameplay is much more of an abstract musical style art form. So it's like, what music has great stories? It's like, that's complicated, right? I mean, there is in a sense a lot of music with great stories, but in my opinion, the best style of storytelling with music is like when you watch a film and it has that score. And is the score telling you a story like in like a traditional sense? No, but it's a more aesthetic. It's more abstract. Like when you listen to certain music, like the Harry Potter soundtrack or the Star Sword, John Williams stuff. Like, is that telling you a story that you logically understand? Probably not. Beethoven or whatever. But the way the music's composed, the way it evokes emotion, that is the power of storytelling. And I think that's the way gameplay works. So with gameplay, you can't tell a story with gameplay in the sense of like, War and Peace or Lord of the Rings, where it's this very like lore and all that kind of stuff. You can throw that on top of it, but the best storytelling, in my opinion, in gaming is stuff that is evocative. That's why when you could take like kind of a basic story and you stick it into a gaming context, and it can actually be much more meaningful to you than it should be, and that it has any right to be honest, because the gameplay can create emotion that you can't get. But you can't, because there's all this talk now about like little narrative dissonance and how like the story and the gameplay don't match up. And that's always going to be the case, because game design is abstract. You're not gonna, if you make a game where the story and gameplay actually line up and is like well written and everything, it's gonna be the most boring shit you've ever played in your life. It's gonna be basically the culmination of this is the walking section. Like, if you believe that game design should be narrative and linear and like a story, the ultimate form of game design, the best form of game design, is walking sections, where they literally put you in the story and they make you in time go along with it. And we all know those fucking suck. Those are garbage. But so like, in my opinion, the games that have some of the best stories are going to be games where the story itself is a little bit more abstract, or it isn't like, that's why I also think why games really struggle to be put into film version and stuff like that. It's like, why don't you make a movie about a song? It's like, you could, but that's very difficult. So that's my view on games. I might have to do a video on that pretty soon and piss off most of the internet about it. But
Hey, I'm all
like
for that.
I think the best video game stories are ones that are like, for example, there's a great quote by the guy who did Doom where he said, like, video game stories are like porn. That's like, I think that's way more accurate than people realize, because like the best video game stories are more of like scenarios and more like a framework to contextualize the gameplay. Like, not again, hate to keep doing this, but like the Dark Souls series really gets this right, because when you're playing Dark Souls, like, I don't know what the fuck is happening in that game's story. I'm sorry if I'm ruining your monetization. I just realized that.
Oh no, that's all good. We're not. I
So
don't even think we are. So
you can fuzz me or whatever. But
not a
like,
big deal.
that that game, do you know what the hell is happening in Dark Souls story? If you're one of those like real researchers, maybe you might. You don't. But the way the game evokes feelings and emotions and setting, and you feel like what you're doing is like something's going on, but it's more abstract. I would say that type of storytelling in gaming is much more effective, at least for me. Like, when I'm playing a game and I feel like some stuff's going on here, but it's like the vibe, like Super Metroid, stuff like that. Like, I love Super Metroid's setting and vibe and feel. The plot of that game is incredibly basic, but that doesn't matter. It's about the vibe, the framework. So that would be my opinion. Like, the best video game stories are like aesthetic and more of a setting rather than a plot. And I think that's why RPGs really struggle. Like, the JRPG really struggles because it's like bucking against that concept and trying to create this linear plot through gameplay, and it's always like a hot mess, basically.
Yeah, I've never played an RPG that I actually enjoyed. Only exceptions that might come close would be like co-op games, but at that point, I feel like it's cheating because you're not really paying attention to the story. You're just skipping all that stuff.
What do you guys
anyway,
think
so.
about tactical RPGs? I wanted to bring this up with you guys because,
Okay.
like, the one form of RPG that I do kind of enjoy quite a bit are like tactical RPGs. I think there's things they need to do to get better.
You talking
But
about
like,
turn-based specifically, or
yes,
okay,
like Advanced Wars and
right?
stuff like that. Like, where it's like, okay, to me, because it feels like, and I think the RTS guys can kind of get where I'm coming from a little bit. It's like, it feels like tactical RPG is the more correct version of the gameplay. Like, the whole like JRPG thing where you go and you grind random encounters. I feel like that style of game design in its concept is like incorrect. It's not a good form of game design. It isn't. Because what is skill in a art JRPG? Skill is patience and free time.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
that's skill in that game.
Right.
If you have enough patience and free time, you can beat the highest level, the highest difficulty. You just grind. And maybe people really enjoy that, but that's not skill. In like RTS players, no, it's not skill. Imagine in StarCraft if you could just, like, in the competitive game, you could just sit there and grind out matches, and like, as you grind out matches, like, your units get stronger across matches. So a dude who just plays 10,000 matches will beat you because his units are stronger. I mean, that's absurd. And I feel like with RPG turn-based style gameplay, like, it feels to me like tactical RPGs, turn-based RPGs that don't have grinding and don't have leveling up in that sense, to me feel like more proper combat design, game design. But I've wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I was railing against upgrades earlier in one of my anecdotes, and I actually think the same applies to like any sort of scaling seems wrong in terms of this is a permanent thing that happens.
Yeah.
Especially like I think experience and leveling is just wrong. It's like the wrong way to even look at any game design, really. I can't imagine a world where progression systems like that equate to a more satisfying end result. Like, okay, maybe unlocking equipment, because I know some games do that. Like I've played Hades, and that game was
Yeah, I don't like that either.
I wasn't
Yeah,
really a
I'm
fan of the fact that you had to
hardcore
grind it out, because again, it's like there's certain parts of the game that aren't even available to you unless you've
Yes.
put in like
Yeah,
10, 20, 100 hours or
exactly.
whatever, right? And
So
so,
what are you doing?
right.
I brought this up with, I like Devil May Cry in a lot of ways, but there's some flaws with it that I bring up. But like, what is in terms of like true honesty, what is the true version of Devil May Cry? If you ask people and they really think about it, they'll say, okay, so you played the game for 50 hours, you've unlocked all the moves, and then you play on Dante Must Die. That is the actual real game. But to get there, you have to spend God knows how much time, and people, if you're speedrunning it or whatever, but it's a good amount of time. And so it drives me up the wall with these character action games because I know how to do it. I have legacy skill. I don't want to sit around and play through this baby version of the game for 5 hours. Give me Dante Must Die. Give me my shit. And if I want to play the baby version of the game, I can do that. There's campaign, you can select it and go through the baby version, but you should have the full version of the game there and waiting. Imagine this in like freaking StarCraft. You play StarCraft, you go to play, like, okay, you open StarCraft, there's the campaigns. Imagine if you go to play custom map and you can only play Terran. You
Right.
can't play
Or
the
like
other,
half your units are disabled or
or
whatever.
half your units are disabled. It's the dumbest shit ever. But because it's a trend or like a trope of RPG design, it just lands in other places. I don't think it should.
I think if I was going to make an RPG, which is sort of like I try to prompt myself that way, and I've played a number
Yeah.
of them. If I was going to make a RPG and it was going to be turn-based, I would definitely not have those kinds of unlocks or whatever. And instead, I
Right.
think
Exactly.
because even when we think about the nomenclature, the verbs or the words that we use to describe it, it's like, oh, I leveled up. Oh, I got a new
Yes.
skill. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what you would do if you were playing a game, though. Like if you were getting better at something, you'd get more. You'd develop your skills. You would level
Right.
up your level of play. That
It's artificial.
right?
It's
And so we have these systems that are doing it for us. That are even like in the words that we choose to describe them or declare them, define them as. It's like, okay, yeah, you're doing this just so that I can feel a sense of accomplishment or whatever. It's like, yeah, you could do that. You could achieve that organically. And so,
and you know what the sad part about this? This is the sad part. This is a style of game design that is highly effective. It's called gamification.
yes, yeah.
And if you sit down and talk to developers and go to conferences and stuff, they're going to really push this type of game design. And the reason for that, and this is the sad part, is that when it comes to commercial interests, selling your game, not artistic, commercial, gamification is correct. So if you want to sell your game, having this artificial progression, rewarding the player, having like, look at Vampire Survivors or Saviors or whatever it's called, where it has like every time you get a level up, I make fun of that game so much because like the aesthetics of that game are dog shit. Like when you kill enemies in that game, they don't even explode in like natural explosions. They just puff off screen. Like everything of that game is super underdeveloped and like ROM hacky, except the level ups. The level ups, like shit explodes and there's like confetti
ceremony, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's called gamification. And you can stick that type of design on top of anything and it will become more commercial and effective because casinos use this. This comes from like casino game design, like all this stuff. Or like with the Tekken shop, what they did just to be little bitches is they sell you the DLC costume for $4, but you can only buy virtual money in increments of $5.
Oh yeah, of course. Of course. You
But
always have some left over. Why don't you top up again?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's called gamification. And that type of design is effective, but it's effective in the manipulative type of thing. And oh yeah, I talk to indie devs about this all the time. And this doesn't make me like a good counselor because if you want to sell and make money, my advice is not going to help you because it's going to really hurt you in that. But I think artistically, it's garbage. Don't do that artistically, but whatever. But yeah, so unfortunately, I think the poor RPG guys and RTS guys, you're going to run into that everywhere now. I think it's going to really take over your games because they want to sell them.
I don't know if gamification hits RTS the same way, but what I have noticed is that the new sort of meta for monetization is I I'm against all microtransactions. Let me just say, I think they're all bad. Like, I don't actually even think you should be paying for cosmetics. I think that inhibits your creativity of expressing yourself as a player. I think a better way to do it. You talk about grinding and unlocking stuff. If it's a status symbol of your achievements in the game, that's a little bit different for me visually.
Yeah.
Like, I was thinking about having some kind of fancy thing that I could program in for people who won tournaments in our game. And it's like, okay, that's exclusive to them because they won a tournament. That's different than, oh, I paid $100 for this thing or whatever. Like, I find that all scummy. And I think,
you know what?
Yeah,
I want to add to this because this is a point that I agree with you on. But I think there's a nuance here that a lot of people don't talk about, which is like, because we both agree 100%. Like this whole microtransactions, cosmetics, bullshit. Microtransactions for characters, that's bullshit. Microtransactions for half the game. It's like, we'll give you half, then you have to buy the other half or whatever. That's all crap. But when you bring these arguments up with people, a lot of people will say, well, this is a necessity. This has to be done to make money. And my response to that is a little bit different, which is like, okay, I can accept that if you are willing to admit that it is artistically degrading. If you at least make that admission as the developer that you are degrading your game artistically and you know that you're doing it, I actually think that's a much healthier place to be. Because now, when we talk about it, because when you talk about this shit now, people try to justify this stuff artistically, like it's actually good design. But if the conversation was, hey, I know the economy is really tough right now. I know selling your game is really tough right now. Maybe you do need to squeeze this extra money to get this off the ground and everything. But as long as you acknowledge that what you're doing is degrading to your game artistically, I think that really changes the tone of the conversation, because what you could do, it's not the best thing in the world, but let's say you're a developer, you're in a tough spot, you need to make some extra money, and you start bringing in some microtransactions for cosmetics, you start making money, but then you make enough money where you're like, okay, we're good. Then you get rid of them. You're like, okay, now that was, it's like I had to strip on the weekends to get through college, but we're done stripping now. And now let's get rid of them. I think that would be a much healthier conversation, because I do get that the economics of this stuff can be really tough, but as long as everyone acknowledges that this is like a commercial move, not an artistic move, I think the conversation would be in a much better place. Because what happens now is people have that cognitive dissonance, so then they try to justify it like it's good game design. Like, oh no, man, like buying the cosmetics of the game like brings whatever. I've heard all kinds of dumb shit like that. It's like, come on.
or they
Let's just
oftentimes
be
think
real.
about it like, oh, I'm spending money so I can express myself. Well, imagine if you could do that without having to spend the money. Wouldn't that be better?
Yeah.
Like,
Or what if you don't have the money so you can express yourself now? What about that?
And yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. The whole thing doesn't make sense.
And I
to
think
me.
too, I think it puts developers who are more artistically minded in a little bit of a more comfortable position, because then at least you can, like, if you do end up having to do this, like you just, okay, to put two ends together here, I got to do this. At least you can come into it with a proper mindset, come into it with the proper, like, okay, I'm making a concession here. I'm doing something that's degrading the game, but hopefully in the future I can pull this back and I can adjust it and that type of thing. I think that makes the conversation a lot healthier.
I've also seen
Because
in some indie
yeah.
games they've done supporter packs, which is literally just like, oh yeah, if you want to support us, here's like some small trimmings or whatever, and you pay like $5 or whatever. And that is like, I mean, you're phrasing it deliberately as like, do you like if you want to take this extra step, or the same thing would be like putting a donation link on your Steam page or something. I don't even know if that's allowed actually, but like whatever, if you wanted to do something like that, if you wanted to communicate that to your players, right?
It gets so murky too, because the question always becomes what is DLC and what isn't. And the hard thing is that this is a gray area and everyone tries to act like it's not, but it really is. Because like, let's say you make your game, right? And it comes out, and when you make it, you've put everything you have into that game. You've left nothing unturned. Every thing you could come up with and put into that game, you put into it. And then you make money. And then 2 years later, you add in extra content and charge for it. It's like,
oh, I see what
you could.
What's the line between expansion pack, which is what we used to have?
Yeah, where's that line?
Yeah.
But so like everything there sounds very above board. Sounds very like, hey, that makes a lot of sense. And the thing about video games that makes them very unique is that they are these digital art forms that can grow in crazy ways and adjust in crazy ways that other art forms can't. You don't have songs don't just gain an extra minute or something. That'd be interesting. 3 years later, they add an extra minute to it or whatever. But So games are very unique in that aspect. But then there's the other thing where we see this all the time too, especially with larger games, is they have that shit already. They that was in the initial budget, that extra content,
Oh
but they
yeah.
pull it.
Yeah.
They
Right.
pull it and
Yeah.
hold it. How do you prove that they did that? You know, it's very murky. And so like these types of things, it's really hard to just have like this whole overall blanket of, does this work? Does this not work? You know, so I think the best you can do is it's like a case by case basis of like, does this fall in line with the nature of the game? Does this fall in line with what you're offering the players? Does this seem legit, or does this seem like gamification stuff where you're kind of exploiting your player base a bit? And that gets really complicated.
What's interesting
Because, like,
about
for
your
example, StarCraft Brood War is
right.
like is my favorite RTS. That bitch is an expansion.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
thing is not even the original game.
Yeah.
But I would never want a universe where StarCraft Brood War doesn't exist. But at the same time, you know what I'm saying? It's like it's murky because if they fucked it up and they made StarCraft, double Helix or something, and it was a big pile of garbage, but then that goes on top of the original StarCraft and ruins it. I mean, that happens too. So it's like, that's what I'm saying. It's like case by case of like, you have to actually assess, did this improve the game? Was it a good step forward with the game design? Or was it a big pile of crap that you're just throwing in there for money? Yeah, it gets so complicated.
The meta lesson is almost like, and I do think that, I don't know how this even happens. Like, I come from a world, like, I'm not doing so well financially that I can just afford to, like, for example, okay, Helldivers 2 came out recently, and it's like $40 on Steam. I'm not in a place where I can say, oh yeah, I'm just going to blindly throw at that. No, I need to research it. Like, is it actually going to be fun? Do I have enough people who already own it or who are interested in playing that kind of game? And like, is it going to be a satisfying experience? So I have to do some research in order to see if is my money going to be spent well on this. A $40 purchase is something I consider. And so, I don't know what kind of state people are in where they can spend $60, $70, $80 on like AAA games and then be like, oh, I guess it's not finished yet or something because like they didn't finish the game and they released it.
I've really tried to get into the mind of this type of consumer rather than like, you know what I mean? Like trying to understand them a bit.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And I think where it comes from is a lot of these types of players they feel something's missing. And this is why this is hilarious, not to be too mean, but what you'll watch like other YouTubers, like ones that cover more mainstream games, and the reviews are like this. 8, 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Great game, great game. And you just watch their videos and they're like, oh, they love every game ever. They're having such a great time. And then randomly in middle of all this, they'll drop a video that's like, I'm depressed. I can't stand games. Why aren't games fun anymore? I don't like gaming anymore. Yeah. And then the next video, 9 out of 10. Like, there's wild, something happening under the surface here that you're not expressing. Where, I feel like I try to, on my channel, I may bitch and complain more about YouTuber than other YouTubers, but you at least know it won't shock you what I'm going to, I won't have this veneer of, I love everything. And then I make a video, I'm so depressed and miserable and I hate everything, At least if I'm miserable and bitching about things, where it's happening. But what I'm getting at is, I think this type of gamer, they feel something is missing, but they can't figure out what it is. And it's not, they don't have the words and language and understanding, because think of the critic space. The critic space is a bunch of just garbage. Think of the YouTuber space. Most of it's just garbage. Everyone's just shilling everything. Masterpiece. What's the monthly masterpiece this month? So they're trying, they're searching. I think that's what's happening. And so they're willing to take these bigger risks of like, and they're wondering, because these videos that you read and hear about, like, why isn't gaming fun anymore? You would think a lot of these videos would have like, because I made a video like this as a response to the other videos and like had these bullet points and like this whole like philosophy about it. But a lot of these videos, it's more like they're asking the question, why? I don't understand.
They don't know.
Why.
They don't have an answer to
They
provide,
don't know.
Yeah.
So I think this is what's happening, is this demographic of consumer, they're searching for something, but they don't know what it is. So that's why they'll just be like, all right, I'll try it. I spend $60 on this. I'll spend the microtransactions. They seem to like them. They're searching, I think, is my guess. They're not having fun with gaming, but they used to have fun with gaming. And they're just trying to find something to connect with, and they're struggling.
And I guess the money part is just incidental. They happen to be well off that they don't care about that.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of effective marketing. Admittedly, we go back to the reviewer thing. There's a lot of effective marketing on the idea of like, this game's really good. It does this thing that's like really new. It's like this game that you know, but it's different in these, superficial ways, but they don't say that they're superficial in the review. And so
they don't even say they're superficial. They say they're better.
Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah,
Resident Evil 4 Remake.
Oh yeah.
Resident Evil 4 Remake isn't just this watered down fan version of Resident Evil 4. It is an improvement and a better masterpiece. It's a masterpiece, and it's much superior to the original game. So, of course, you see all this, and you're like, I love Resident Evil 4. I've got to buy this shit. I mean, it's better. It's a masterpiece. And then they play it, and they're like, I guess.
Right, well, the reviewer said so. And maybe it goes back to what we talked about earlier with the competitive stuff. It's like, well, it feels better in the moment to not get attacked.
And I think most games, the mainstream games at least now, like if you bring up a lot of these things that we care so much about, they're like, because if you can get the consumer through that first playthrough, mission accomplished. That's all they need. They need you through that first playthrough, get out of the refund period, get out of like the period where you would even feel the need to refund it. Just get you through that first playthrough. Mission accomplished. And you'll even see this in like game developer talks and stuff. It's like the most important playthrough is the first playthrough, because if they don't play through it once, they'll never play through it again. It's like, well, yeah, but you don't even care if they play through it again, obviously. You just want that first playthrough so they don't refund the game. But for me, the first playthrough is the shittiest playthrough. The best playthrough is always like the 15th, 20th, 40th. Imagine you mentioned Metal Slug. Imagine you judged Metal Slug on the first playthrough of that game. You'd be like, fuck this. What is this? Getting randomly spammed by shit, ran over by things. Like, no, but the most rewarding, it's a game that builds on itself. Same with strategy games. Imagine the first time you play a strategy game, that's supposed to be the best version of it. No. And that's not good game design.
You said earlier, like you gave the tennis example of, we were talking about difficulty, and it's like I expect to just be able to win my first tennis match, because I've never played tennis before. Maybe I never even watched tennis before. I know sort of like the instruments that they use. That's it. It's like, there's a funny anecdote that somebody shared a while back where they said that their friend was going out to the store or something, and so he told his buddy, hey, hop on Quake. I'm playing Quake 3. You can play Quake 3 with these guys. And it's like a server of like 20-year veterans or whatever, ridiculous amount of time. And so he gets mopped the floor with, and then 30 minutes later, the guy comes back from the grocery store, and he's like, well, the game's pretty cool, but I thought I should be able to get some frags here. And it's like, because his mind is warped by like, I'm playing with what would in any other discipline be like, grandmaster tier player or something, some high up the ranked ladder if we had ladders for Quake. And it's like, you're playing against those guys and you just sat down and never played it before. And you think, because of the way that games have evolved or devolved maybe, like you think, I should be able to win. I should be able to get a couple kills. Even if I don't have a good scoreboard, it would be better than if I got 0 kills. And so it's like, why did I get 0 kills in 30 minutes on this server? Well, the reason is you haven't played, you haven't practiced, and it's a skill.
This is why I think your fan base plays some FPSs and stuff, right?
Yeah.
I think this is why the battle royale genre has really taken off, because I'll give you an example of my little brother. So my brothers are not like really hardcore in the sense of like they love the types of genres that I like and everything, but they are hardcore in that they are really fucking good at FPS games, like way better than I am. And so like especially my younger brother, he was just raised on Call of Duty. That motherfucker just annihilates people in that game. And even when he was a kid, he was like quick scoping and shit. I was like, how are you even learning this? He's learning it from YouTube and everything. But anyway, so I used to sit and watch him play Call of Duties, and his win rate was like 80%. He'd win free for all matches, team matches, like insane win rates. Then he started playing these battle royale games, and I'd sit and watch him play them, and he'd just get killed by the most random bullshit. And like he was really practicing and getting him, and his win rate was like 30%. But he'd get into like the top 10 pretty consistently. But then from that point, it's a toss up.
Yeah.
It's just a toss up. What's going to happen? And I think that's why battle royale games have really taken off, because as long as you're in there, you do have a chance to win through pure luck. If anything else, you do have that viable chance, versus if you're playing against a grandmaster Quake player, where you're just owned. There's no, you're just owned. There's nothing there's no like random thing he's gonna drop his mouse and you're gonna win.
Yeah.
There's no sort of like random
There's
element there.
no Mario Kart Blue Shell, right? There's nothing to get you out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why Mario Kart has these elements. Like Nintendo knows, they know we can't let you just annihilate your competition consistently. So we'll add in these elements like blue shells and all these types of, or like you can't get too far ahead to prevent that, and that's actually really good for popular games. This is why you're saying before how like RTS players, they want to play team games because then you can get the RNG of an amazing teammate who's like god tier. So the natural RNG is you could be shit, but if you just get a teammate who's really good, you could still win. So like that type of design is very popular right now. And a lot of the popular games go for that versus like that Quake thing. That poor guy. Yeah. Tell him, all right, just play the game for 5 more years and maybe you'll get a frag.
Right. Yeah.
It's not
yeah,
going to
exactly.
do that. It's not going to do that shit.
No. But that's also kind of a shame because it feels like, again, and Quake is also a game where, funnily enough, the single player does not really match the multiplayer at all. It's a completely two different worlds, right? But that was more maybe part of the. I think that's fine for the time because it's such a progenitor, but we haven't learned from that. That's
they
like
had no idea. Right. They had no idea.
And we haven't looked at that with a critical eye and thought, how could this be better? Because you either have like the opinion, like, okay, evolution, right? Like what you were saying, we're now on Windows 12, like let's forget about Windows 98. It's like either you're like that, and so you just disregard Quake, which is kind of like Chesterton's fence almost. It's like, well, why wouldn't I remove this thing that's in my way? Well, maybe it's in your way because limitations are good and all this other stuff. But also, if you're
you don't even understand it.
Right.
You don't understand Quake.
Yes.
To begin with.
Right. And so you either dismiss it out of hand because you're, a modernist, if you want to call it that, from the game design school, or you like overly put it on a pedestal. And I find this with Brood War people a lot too.
Yes.
It's like, I am born and raised Brood War. It was my first strategy game. And it's definitely the one that I thought was like...
I'm absolutely guilty of this.
Okay. Yeah. For me, it's like, you either think that that's the best, like, okay, I actually do think Brood War is the best RTS that we've had. But my conception of best is like, if you had to put it on a relative scale, I'm imagining something so much better that it's like a 4, And it's like, if the best thing you've ever made in the whole genre is like a 4 out of 10, then most people are going to think, well, for one, you've got ridiculous standards, and maybe I do. But for another, it's like, well, what could possibly be 10? Like, how could we get to 10? It's like, well, we learn by looking at what came before us in the genre, and we try to be almost a little bit historian about it and like figure out, how did we get here? That's one of the reasons I play so many old games is like, was there anybody trying to do interesting things sort of around the corner from the popular games? What can you find out if you go back to look at what for our time now, we would consider them indie releases? It's like these weird jank Korean games that they made that have like their own, not Terra, not Zerg, not Protoss, they have the same races basically, but they're different stuff like that. And so, anyway, going back and through all that has given me a perspective of like, I know what people were thinking. I know what people were trying. And yes, in some ways it's different than what we have now, but also what we're trying now or what we're seeing now is in many ways a devolution, just like what you were talking about with arcade games and stuff. It's like, I don't know. I look at the way that the genres are evolving, and it's like, especially for the single player content, people just push that right off a cliff. There's not really any hope for a translation between that and the competitive audience. They take it for granted in that way, where it's like what you said about the popular RTS games or popular fighting games, where it's like, you guys will do it. You guys will do our competitive development for us, or maintenance.
And the fans, and the annoying thing is that the fans are more than happy because it gives them something to do.
Right.
So it's like, I am the community representative of StarCraft or whatever it is. And so like, I'm more than happy to do your work for you, Blizzard. Don't you worry. I'm more than happy to do it because it gets me kind of involved in stuff. Oh yeah, it's a big mess. But I wanted to build on your point because I really liked what you said about how StarCraft Brood War is a 4 out of 10. If you're looking at it for like the potential scale, because this is a sand trap. Arcade players fall into this sand trap all the time because there's this balance you have to find that's very difficult, where you don't want to be like a lot of the game journalist types now, where you disregard the past and the developments of the past. You just like dismiss them. You don't understand the strengths, but you don't want to do the other thing, which a lot of my fan base can sometimes fall into, or like older arcade enthusiasts can fall into, where now you're putting the past on this untouchable pedestal that it cannot be passed. And when it comes to like creating great art, you'll see this across all great artists, not just game developers. Like the best artists, like respect their forebearers, but then they also kind of shit talk them a little bit because in order to create something great, you have to believe you can do something better. So like you talk to Leo Tolstoy and he'd be like, yeah, these other writers from the past are good and everything, but I'm gonna take it to the next level, bitch. And so like I think that game developing should be that way as well, where you look at StarCraft Brood War. Devil May Cry is like this as well in the action game fan base. Like, there's a lot of great strengths of that, but there's shit you can look at, like Brood Wars, and like you said, like the single player campaign, the AI. I mean, clearly the AI is garbage. The game would be better if the AI was more developed, more robust, more in line with the meta of the actual competitive gameplay. But you get a lot of people who are very traditionalist or whatever you'd call it, where if the game did it in the past one way, that was good because they like it. So if they keep doing it, it's still good. I run into this all the time when I do game reviews where I'll critique an element of a game and they'll be like, "Ugh, you idiot. Don't you know that in the first game it had this and in the second game it had this?" I'm like, yeah, I do know that. So what? Like, there's like this grandfathering in of bad game designs. Like, as long as it was shitty 4 times in a row, it's good the fifth time, you know? So yeah, and parsing through that is very complicated though. And that's the thing is like, you can't, it's very easy to just be like, games of the past are, underdeveloped. We're doing the new thing now. And it's also very easy to say, well, games of the past are perfect and we'll never touch them. When the reality is, like, it's more of like games of the past had strengths that are unrecognized, and we should find those strengths. But then there's also weaknesses, obviously, that should be improved. And that's where you get to the next level. So I definitely agree there that I could easily imagine a game much better than Brood War, but the actual execution of that is much more complicated than people realize. So,
Well, yes. So you have to
yeah.
both hold it in your head as a great example to learn from, and also as a game that is only 4 out of 10, right? That's at least in my
Yes.
experience.
Yeah.
Sort of
That's
like
what you have to do.
your Tolstoy example, or one of the things that made me think of is how like you also want to be critical of your own work if you've done a lot of work in the space. Like that's how you learn. I mean, that's how you learn as a player. Is you look back at what you did as a player and see like, okay, I used to be this bad, now I'm this good, or whatever. And so it's very similar. There's like so much of that that's a track of like if you extrapolate out everybody working on design problems as one person or one body, and you think of them as like, are they learning from the mistakes? Is this body, is this organism learning from its
Yeah.
mistakes? Well, not really in practice, actually. We've ignored a lot of what was interesting or
Yeah.
something worth taking from the past. And we've also, we're ignoring what's wrong about what we're dealing with right now, like in general, overall. And so I'm really hopeful that, it's a weird space to be in because we're getting into territory now with the project that I'm working on right now where it's like we have no idea what the future is going to look like for it because we're getting into the territory where genuinely nobody's ever done it. Like nobody's ever made an RTS game that has Brood War style like unit design where the individual units matter and positioning of them matters and you got to be precise with the micro. But also you're talking about like army sizes that are pushing 1,000 even in 1v1s, like if the game gets late enough, and you're talking about like huge scale and you have 50 units per race to explore and tech through. And it's like the games can go for an hour and you haven't even seen all the units in the game yet, even though it's gone for that long. And so like we have both the opportunity for stuff to end earlier than that, but also if the game goes long enough, there's like little on ramps you can take to like increase scale, little on ramps you can take to more tech. And I haven't experienced a game like that, despite having played so many different RTS games. I know that there are some games that have the unit count, maybe that we're talking about for individual like units of like, oh yeah, you have 1,000 units in this RTS, and then maybe this RTS has like a bunch of units that have like, okay, yeah, it's like 50 different units, but all the units are kind of the same and they overlap a lot. And it's like, oh yeah, like this tank, this tank is like this tank, and then this infantry is like that infantry, and there's a lot of difference in disparity where like each unit can kind of serve its own niche, but also be used. Some of them can be used more as a generalist, and so you have to choose. Like part of the game becomes making a composition, and also doing that at scale, and that combination of things is like one of the things that I think is also underexplored. And so anyway, I don't know if there's an example you can think of off the top of your head for an arcade or action game type of environment for that, where it's like
there's a very
hit me.
There's a very obvious example, and I hate to, like I'm saying, we can't let the game journalists take this from us.
Sure.
But a very obvious example of that, to address your game, for example, I would say, because shmup developers, arcade developers run into this all the time, is that unfortunately with certain styles of design, It's not that they can't catch on and be popular, but sometimes it takes time for it to happen. Like it literally sometimes takes time. Look at my freaking channel. I've been doing this for forever. And there's been many points in my channel where I'm like, this is freaking hopeless. There's no way. And it's just this year where it feels like now it's starting to get a little bit wider. I'm breaking out of just this small, tiny thing, but it's time. Like that's all, I've improved things here and there, like honed in things, but there's not like this magic bullet I shot at my channel and all of a sudden it flipped. It's just time and slowly like grinding on people over years, wearing them down. And I feel like with innovative game design, same thing. Sometimes innovative ideas, sometimes they'll pop off right away, but a lot of it, especially like really fundamental sound, good ideas, it's just this slow like push forward. And an example of that is Dark Souls. I hate to, use that again, but remember the first Dark Souls? It became something. But if you look at where Elden Ring now is commercially, it's insane. I said this on like a random podcast one time where we're talking about Elden Ring, and I was saying, you guys don't understand how much of a watermark Elden Ring is for this style of game, because I went to a party full of like bros and stuff, and like if they ever they don't really game, and if they ever game, they talk about Madden or Call of Duty. Not judging, just how it is.
No, yeah, it's
And I
mainstream
went to this,
stuff.
yeah, I went to this party with a bunch of bros, and they're talking about like games and stuff. And then one guy was like, "Have you guys heard of this game? That's really cool. I've never seen anything like it." I'm like, "Oh, what is it?" And I was like thinking, I was thinking it was gonna be something obscure, of course. He's like, "Elden Ring? Have you ever heard of that?" And all the guys at the party were like, "No, what is it?" And he's like, "It's this game." And it was so funny. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be a douche, but it was so funny to hear like a casual Call of Duty bro explain Elden Ring to other casual Call of Duty bros, and they're like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah." And so I was like, "That's a moment. That is a moment of a Japanese action style game breaking into a mainstream audience." And you look at the sales of that game, it's like fucking insane. Like that is a game that bucked a lot of industry trends. And now the industry is like trying to copy it, and everything's a Dark Souls clone now, unfortunately. But you can't take that away from that series accomplished, because before then, if you go back and look at FromSoft, they were just getting pile drived by game critics. Go back and read reviews of old FromSoft games. They're just getting pile drived by IGN and all these other. Yeah. So if you're like a industry person and you're looking at like what developers should we invest in for a great quarter or whatever, they're looking at like Activision, all this stuff. No one in their right mind would have ever looked at FromSoft and been like, this is a great idea. Let's invest in these like laughing stock Kuso gay Japanese developers. But FromSoft, they're the little engine that could. They kept at it, and they kept iterating and building. And now Dark Souls is this cultural force in gaming, but it didn't start there, and it wasn't overnight. And so I feel like RTS and like some of these more hardcore genres will have a similar path where like there's hope for the genres and hope for these more hardcore genres, but it's going to be this grind forward. It's not going to be like you wake up one night and everyone's playing, a new style of Brood War, but like slowly you just start infiltrating, you start taking back players from the MOBA games. Like, fuck you, we're taking these guys back slowly over time. I think so. Like your game, maybe when it first launches, maybe, it's going to be a little much for the casuals and they're going to be like, this is way too technical and stuff. But you just slowly iterate, build, continue. And I think that's the path forward.
So it's really funny because in many ways, we've already been described as the Dark Souls of RTS. So I guess we'll see if we can live up to the
Yeah.
uppermost level of that
Yeah.
billing.
And we can't
So,
let the game journalists take
yeah.
that from us, the Dark Souls stuff, because they're latching on to that, but they don't even understand what Dark Souls did. They just looked at it and they're like, oh, it's popular and hard. They don't understand the achievements of that series. Uh, yeah, it's opened the doors for a lot of action games now, I think. Unfortunately, the thing about Dark Souls is kind of complicated because it's like, in one way, it's like open the doors for more fundamental, like checkpoints and difficulty and all that stuff. Then other way, unfortunately, it's like removed certain aspects of other games because they just copy Dark Souls. So, like, for example, character action games now, they all feel like we need stamina bars now. I'm like, guys, you don't need stamina bars in action games. Like, Dark Souls is an RPG. Don't forget the RPG's like stamina is an RPG mechanic. Don't put stamina bars in your action games. But anyway, so you can't just copy it, obviously, but the path in terms of like what it did in terms of industry and that, I think that's a really strong example that other genres and hardcore games can follow, because it wasn't an overnight success, and it wasn't game journalists weren't hopping on its dick right away. It took time.
Well, it's almost created its own subgenre. That's why you hear Souls-like
Yes.
everywhere, right?
Yes, it is. I
yeah.
legitimately, yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
It's replaced the Devil May Cry like.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny. It would almost feel like beating a dead horse a little bit, but to talk about the whole angle of trying to make your game more accessible, because I almost feel like I've read an article, and I haven't, but I could read it in my brain of a game reviewer saying, what Dark Souls is missing is accessibility, so that more players can experience.
Oh, there's
you know what I mean?
hundreds
Like,
of them.
Yeah,
there
I'm sure. There must be so many
Yes.
think pieces about stuff like that. And
they
it's like, no,
don't
you missed the whole
understand.
point of the game. Like the reason
They
it's
don't
popular.
understand. Yeah. If Dark Souls was easy, it wouldn't be what it is now. Because again, like we were saying, the difficulty is the game. It's so weird. I think just because our reviewer class mostly comes from like, the like frustrated writers, or they actually want to review films and stuff, but
absolutely.
they can't get jobs.
Yeah.
So they get jobs reviewing games, and they try to treat them like that.
I almost feel like games writers are like that too, by the way. Just as a quick aside,
absolutely.
I feel like game writers want to be writing movies, and that's why they keep putting them into our games.
Exactly. No, that is it.
Yeah.
They see that as a path into movies. They're like, I'm going to write this amazing game. And sometimes it is, so it is what it is. But but with what I'm saying, though, is that they don't understand. Like, imagine if you applied this criticism to other types of art. You'd be laughed out of the room. What if you're like, well, Miles Davis made some great jazz and great compositions, but don't you think they're a little complicated, and like you need to kind of know about jazz a little too much? So why didn't he just write pop songs? It's like, why isn't there a Miles Davis album with like a pop song in it? Or why isn't there, like those more experimental films? Like, what if they explained the plot a little bit more? It's like, no, obviously not. And that's like the art. The difficulty is part of that art. If Dark Souls was easy, it would literally be a different game. Literally.
Okay, so I have a couple angles we can go on here. We're pushing the 2-hour mark. I guess I'll say, because I feel like I could talk to you about like 5 or 6 more times at this length, at this rate. So we definitely have a lot of open ends that I'm trying to figure out how to weave back. I want to push back on a point you mentioned about, because you talked about art as like games as art, and you made a great answer that I really have been sitting here thinking about in the back of my head about how games are more like music. A good story or whatever in a game is more like music as opposed to a narrative. I think it's possible, maybe this is naivete, but I think it's possible to reclaim some narrative elements within a game without it being, like you described, and I agree with this description of a lot of games, is that they're boring, they're mind-numbing, you walk and you mash the A key or whatever, and it's like, yeah, just get me past this section, I want to go back to playing the game. And I describe that as like the story has to catch up to wherever you are in the game, because it's like, oh, we didn't integrate it properly. And I think the problem is kind of like what we were talking about with certain aspects of game design not being mapped out, is that it feels like the stories are never actually intertwined properly in a way that feels like it's a value add instead of this sideshow / detraction that you hope you can skip. And maybe the developers forgot to program in the skip cutscene button or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's not really it. Like I have to play Death Stranding at some point, and that's basically all about that as far as I know. Yeah. So, that just looking at it from that lens, it's like, okay, how do I make it so that these are the same? And I think you can tell a story without using dialogue at every step or cutscenes. Like one of the things that I've been thinking about in the context of an RTS is, what story does it say if your opponent is like imagine an AI enemy and they're kind of like trolling you. Like their first strategy is to like cannon rush you or something. And it's like they're proxying or whatever, and they're doing some sort of cheese. And they only start taking you seriously after you like defeat that like really handily. And then they'll start to like play more seriously, right? And it's like, that tells you a story. Like they think you're a fool. Like they don't want to pay attention to you at all. So I feel like if you had a story that was essentially like the premise. If we go back to the premise, because one of the great things that you made is like stories are often like scenarios or premises. If those can be
Yeah.
good for games. If the premise is, okay, maybe there is like a grander narrative, but we just look at the individual mission premise of this level, you're going to get attacked by somebody who thinks that you're a pushover and just wants to rush you down. Like that's actually what happens in the tutorial. He just tries to steamroll you with early units. He sees if he can like abuse like a particular strategy that you can learn very quickly to try to deny him. And it's like, if you deny him that, then the map is really defensible and easy to hold out on, but he might still overwhelm you with time. And that's like when he'll get more grumpy because you're wasting his time in his mind. And so if that's happening, you don't really need dialogue that much to even communicate that. It's like, it's right there. One of the things that was interesting recently is we had people say, oh, he's talkative when he's owning you, like when he's beating you, but if you start beating him, he shuts up. And like, that's because he's starting to take you seriously again. And it's like kind of part of the thought anyway. And so I feel like you can have stuff like that, and part of it is influenced in my own journey making stuff. But I always thought this. I always thought that like the story, the ludonarrative dissonance, right? The story not being connected to the game is not something that is like, it doesn't have to be there. Like you could do it better. And I don't know if you've played games that have made you reconsider that either, but that's my initial thought is like, okay, yes, most games that have like involved narratives and stories don't do it properly because the gameplay doesn't actually tell a coherent story. But I don't necessarily know it has to always be abstract. I think it can be like more concrete, like this guy doesn't really consider you a major threat. So instead of him just taunting you through dialogue, which will get really boring after a while, especially if he doesn't back it up in the gameplay will tell you that. Like the fact that he just disregards you enough to sort of like proxy you or whatever is going to be enough to tell you that. It would be like if somebody tried to beat you in a fighting game with only using one move, and it was like a cheesy strategy that as soon as you figure out how to counter it, they've got to play differently. And then when you do that, they start to switch. It's like, oh, this character or person in the game and story doesn't respect me or my character or whatever, and I have to prove to them that I am worth that respect. I feel like that's something that I've just never seen within RTS before. So I don't know if you've seen that in any game before, but that would be something that I would push back on as like a way to do it.
So the way it works, in my opinion, is like there's certain elements of what you would consider storytelling that work better than other elements. So with like characterization, you can characterize someone through gameplay. So like, yeah, there are examples of this in like fighting games and stuff, or like like think of KOF final bosses where they're like ultra powerful, like in game, like they obliterate you and they taunt you and stuff. Like that's an example of using gameplay to characterize something. And I think that works because the issue you run into with narrative in gameplay and why I compare it to music more is music is very repeatable and it's meant to be replayed. So you listen to a song thousands of times. It's meant to be replayed. Gameplay is like that as well. Gameplay is meant to be replayed over and over. So there's certain things you can do in gaming that are like narrative-y that work in terms of replayability. So like characterizing a character that doesn't fall apart upon replay, right? He's still that character and he's still acting in this way. And yeah, it creates a distinctive gameplay experience. So like for characterization, it's fine. But the stuff with ludonarrative dissonance that's a problem has to do more with immersion and realism. And that's like that ship is gone because the problem and like plot. Because for example, let's say the walking section, the famous walking section where there's a conflict of interest that happens where if you have a character in your game that's like trolling you and acting a certain way, that doesn't conflict with replayability. It doesn't conflict with game design. It creates a distinctive gameplay experience. But where it starts to conflict is with like walking sections where the goal of the player is to play the game to get to the gameplay. But then you have this walking section that creates like plot points and tells you a story, but that's in part of the gameplay. And what replayability does that have? What value does that have in terms of game design? If you took this story out, would you ever add a section where you just stand there for 30 seconds and nothing happens? Like that would be absurd in like actual game design. But then they justify that game design decision with some story bullshit. So I think if you think about it like you're putting the game design as the priority and then you have like the narrative as a secondary layer over the top of it, that works much better. That's why I was saying like Dark Souls and Doom and these types of games. That's what they're doing. They don't sit down and say, well, okay, I want to really tell you the life story of this character, so I'm going to have a section where you walk in his room as a baby and pick up a ball and push the ball around. That way you get into the mind of the character. But gameplay wise, it's a nightmare and it's shitty. Like Max Payne has bullshit like this where you like run through the hall. It's like, oh, that's cute one time. Then you get to that section the fifth time you play, like, oh my God, I have to run through the hall again. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about, where if you put the gameplay first and then you even find ways to like make it replayable and contextual, I think that's fine. And I think there's games that pull that off pretty well, like King of Fighters, fucking Ragul at the end or whatever his name is, or what's his name? The other guy from King of Fighters, Geese Howard. You know, like these powerful beasts, and it's like it's integrated into the game design. So I think that works. But I think the problem you run into a lot with like modern games and modern RPGs is they're putting the plot elements over priority of the gameplay, and so it really degrades replayability. And then you have to ask yourself, why am I playing? Like, am I playing for the story or am I playing for the gameplay? And you're going to have a division. Some people are playing for the story, some people are playing for the gameplay, and the two don't always match up. We're like the guy who game journalist who's sitting there and he's playing and there's having the walking section, and explaining the plot. He's like, this is the best thing ever because all I care about is the plot and the story, and I don't want to do that whole fighting enemies stuff. And then you have the guy who's trying to play Bayonetta for like S ranks, and he has to do a section where he runs through a hall for a minute. Like, okay, what am we accomplishing here? So that's the problem with the ludonarrative stuff, is that if a lot of that comes from the solution is backwards, basically. A lot of the ludonarrative stuff, what they're suggesting isn't, okay, forget the story, make the story fit the gameplay. Instead, what it's suggesting is, oh, you need to change the gameplay. So like in what's that one that Naughty Dog game where you go around and you're like a Indiana Jones type guy?
Oh,
I can't remember what it is.
Just Cause? No, not Just Cause. Oh man, Uncharted.
No, what?
Uncharted.
Uncharted, yeah. Like an example of that was like, oh, the character in Uncharted is shown as like this great guy and like kind of a pacifist in the story, but in the gameplay you kill a bunch of people. And so like the conclusion a lot of these game journalists go to isn't, all right, well then don't make him a pacifist, make him a psychotic murderer. So that way the gameplay makes sense. Instead, it's like, no, make the gameplay fit the story. So I think it's just the way you view it is backwards. If you fit the story to the gameplay, correct. If you fit the gameplay to the story, incorrect. Because ultimately, what is the core, right? What is the core of what people are going for? The gameplay. That's the core. So that's my thoughts on it.
I think I definitely agree with what you're saying for sure. Like when it comes to the whole, I feel like it's a misallocation of resources and a total, like they've got it backwards in terms of what they should be focusing on. And maybe that's also downstream of like mass appeal again. Like that does degrade the artistic quality of the product if it's,
Yeah,
talking about it.
I think of a really good analogy here, which is like, hip hop and that type of thing. Because if you talk to people about story and music, the obvious example is hip hop, right? Like the obvious example is, well, hip hop has lyrics that tell stories often, and that's pretty cool. But let's not forget that rappers and hip hop artists know you need to be on beat and you need to rhyme. Like that. So you have to actually structure your story and your lyrics around beats, rhythm, and rhymes. You can't do this thing where you release a rap album where that's just like poetry, that just free verse poetry, and people are like, "What the hell is this?" And you're like, "Dude, I'm not going to be constrained by beats and rhythms. My artistic expression exceeds that." It's like, okay, write actual poetry then, or write, or whatever it is. It's a different art form at that point. If you do free verse, non-rhythmic rap, it's just poetry. It's not the same art form. That would be my same thing. Like if you want to write, you want to make like an interactive game where the story takes place and the gameplay is secondary, like that can exist, like a visual novel, for example. But that is a distinctive art form. Like I like visual novels because they are not games. They consider themselves a distinctive art form. I think that's healthier than this weird thing we have now where it's like Final Fantasy VII is a game, but it's also a story, but it's also a game. And the two elements like don't super fit well together.
It doesn't
So
really know what it is in any given
it doesn't know
moment.
what it is. Yeah, like Final Fantasy VII probably could be like way better as like a visual novel if you really think about it. But if you say that to Final Fantasy fans, piss them off. But like, imagine Final Fantasy VII, like it's just the best, most well-written visual novel of all time. They probably would like that better than the weird, grindy, weird RPG mechanics. Because I've asked RPG fans all the time, like, what if they made an RPG that didn't have Final Fantasy VII's story but had its gameplay? Like, how much would you like that? Would that be iconic at that point, or would it be kind of just lame?
And
So,
yeah,
but
that's a good litmus test too. It's like what part are you actually valuing in your
yeah,
estimation of what it is? And
and the
so
FF fans, the story, I think.
right, for sure. And I still think it's possible. Like my thinking is, I can get you hooked on like a good character and a good setting, like good setting, like settings, most settings and most
Settings are really
stories, most
important.
plots. Right?
Settings are very
Yeah,
important
I would
because
say
you need them to contextualize. Even if you don't have, like, for example, I don't really care about story in gaming all that much at all. Like, I love stories, but I go to usually other art forms for that. But you need some sort of visual container for what's happening, right? And so like the setting is like one of the key things, like one of the best things in video game stories. Like Sin and Punishment, I love the aesthetics and setting and vibe of that game. I have no idea what's happening plot wise, but I love the visual setting and the vibe and all that. So yeah, setting's huge, I think. Setting, characters, aesthetics, all of that I think is much more important than plot.
I also think that when you have games with the really clunky story execution, a lot of the times the plot and both probably the setting as well, when it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, but especially the plot, they're just not meant for games. And that's where you get
Yeah.
into like the backwards design. Like for me,
Yeah.
I painstakingly designed these settings, these like if you want to call them universes or worlds, these game worlds, for the purpose of being a game world, and such that when you play it or when you dig into it in any amount, because there's gonna be information that's passively there you can like pay attention to if you want, or you can just let it be window dressing. But either way, it like it makes sense. Like all of the infantry that you see are actually like clones, and
Yeah.
that's why you can get so many of them, right? And it's like there's like they're clones of people they've been sentenced to many deaths, and they're clones of generate. So it's just it's kind of dark, but it's like okay, like that's color and flavor for the faction that's using them that way.
Yeah.
And it's like okay, that's great. And so that way it's like now we can explain the scale that we're reaching in the game. And so like the universe kind of accounts for that. Whereas like if it's just like in StarCraft 2, like you have like this rebellion that happens at the beginning of the game, and it's like some insurrection stuff, and you don't have that many people. And then at the end you're still following the same guy that led that rebellion to fight like a dark god in the void. And it's like that doesn't make any sense at all when you look at it. It's like who's still going to follow?
Yeah.
And by the way, the whole reason you're following him to begin with is because he's like in love with a character who doesn't love him back. And it's like, well, then the plot doesn't make sense, because who is going to in the right mind lead like a rebellion and be followed by soldiers who are going to be servile to him in exchange for him getting his love? Like that's not a cause that they really care about. I don't think it's not like you know
what
doesn't make any sense.
And speaking of like gameplay story integration, I think a game that does a good job of it is StarCraft Brood War. And StarCraft, I don't know about 2 because I don't like 2, so I dismiss everything about it. But Brood War and the original StarCraft, I think they did a great job in certain ways, because is the plot of StarCraft or StarCraft 2 really like is that like Dune good? No, obviously not. It's like basic shit. But the setting, the characters, the races, that stuff I think is iconic. Zerg, Protoss, Terran, it's iconic. And so it tells things, and like they play differently, and that fits into like the way their races are. Like Terrans play technically because they're techno human, and Zerg rush over everything because they're the like internet, or sorry, like universal insects or whatever. Like so like what I'm saying, the characterization and the gameplay are really good. The plot, thank
Forgettable.
God you can skip.
Yes.
I mean, thank God. Imagine if you played StarCraft Brood War and you had to sit through the fucking
briefings and stuff. Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah.
But I think it's not that I think you should get rid of the briefings. Like I kind of like them. I think they're fun, and they do kind of have a fun context, but you can hit skip. Get that skip button in there. Because I think like the funny thing is like as like conceptual as you can get about this stuff, and it's like how philosophical you can get, like the practical solution I think has basically been figured out. Just don't forget it, which is skip. It's like really it is fixing the issue of like, okay, if you want to play StarCraft Brood War and you want to just play through the campaign and fight stuff, you can just hit skip, It takes 2 seconds, you're in the game. If you want to go through the story and you want to hear about all the, Raynor and Kerrigan and their love and what happens there and how she breaks his heart and everything, which I think is kind of fun, you can do that too. But you don't have to every time. The problem would be if you start the game and then you had to sit through that every time you played. Oh my God. And modern games do that. They have so many sections like this. You have to walk down the hall. You have to carry the person down the hall. Like, why? Just make that a cutscene that I can skip.
Yeah,
please.
Yeah. A lot of sections in games could benefit from being turned into cutscenes, and
that's skippable.
But also the cutscene thing is a bit weird to me because I also think you've seen video compilations crop up on YouTube of like StarCraft 2 all cutscenes or whatever. It's like 4 hours long. Or
I watch the Brood War ones. Sometimes I'll pip it up. Like,
and so you get to see like all of these like, and maybe I don't know if it includes the briefings or not, but it's like all the story information, right? And it's like briefing, hours and hours long. And so without this non-interactive material, if it doesn't respect your time very well by like kind of going on and on, which is sort of like the walking stuff, and it's also not very attention grabbing, then you're going to kind of zone out. And if you skip it, or if you zone out, which might as well be skipping it, except you still wasted your time, then you're going to really be confused at what's going on in the game. And that's another thing that I think is really awkward about games with cutscenes is that if you if you need to watch the cutscene in order to understand the plot, then at minimum, can you make the cutscene like engaging and interesting, which is really hard to do. It's really hard to do if you're not using film, because you get to see all these like micro expressions on people's faces and have experienced actors tell like an interesting story without using their mouth. They just like on their face, you can see it. You don't get any of that just by, like watching digital recreations of it that are kind of done as like emulation of a Hollywood film. Like the biggest thing is that new DMC game. I guess there's 2 of them now, but like the DMC Devil May Cry, like literally called that. It actually has like a film team. Like they had a film team and like writers and stuff, like for specifically just the cutscenes. Like they had a whole department of cutscene people. And it's like, if you have that, you've already kind of missed it for me. Like I don't think I can connect with you if you have to have like a whole staffing group specifically for the cutscenes, because that you're going to have to really do a great job and basically make a film inside a game. And even then, I don't know that I would want to watch a film while playing a game. So I don't even think that would cut it. But that would be the minimum requirement, and nobody hits that requirement,
Yeah, the ultimate answer is one that annoys people, because the ultimate answer is like like I said, you can't tailor the gameplay to the story. If you want to do that, make a visual novel or make a different medium. But you can't communicate really complex, crazy shit in gameplay. You can communicate certain things in gameplay, but you can't communicate, very specific plot details and stuff in gameplay. So what you have to do, if you want like a very pure form of story gameplay integration, is you have to simplify that story into something that can be understood a little bit more instinctually, right? Not so specific. But people want like specific plot narrative shit in games. So if you want that, I think you have to do this kind of Band-Aid solution where you like stick it next to it, and it doesn't integrate well. But if you try to integrate it in there, you're like I said, it's like me trying to rap The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is a beautiful work of literature. Can you turn that beautiful work of literature into a hip hop song? No, you can't. So if you want to make a hip hop song about The Great Gatsby, you have to revise it. You have to simplify it. You have to change it. You have to shorten it. It needs to be 3 minutes long. You need to hit like the main plot points and little verses and stuff. It's just a different medium with different constraints. And I think that's the way of games. So there's really funny examples of this. Like Guilty Gear has this very complex, crazy ass plot, but you can't obviously understand that while fighting each other. So what Guilty Gear does, that's kind of funny, it's interesting, is they literally have an anime film that they just include in the game, in the menu. So you go to the menu and you just watch an anime, and that's Guilty Gear. I'm like, that's kind of a cool idea. That's kind of a cool solution. It's like, if you really want the story, it's well done, well paced. I mean, it's anime. It's not like the greatest thing ever, but it's like better.
I'll talk about getting fans on the internet, by the way, with that comment.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I think even anime fans have to admit, like in the tier list of anime, I don't think the Guilty Gear anime is gonna be like super high. Probably it's not Ghost in the Shell or something. But my point is like that is kind of more on track with than trying to have this weird campaign type of thing and all that. Like it's a little bit more. It's like accepting that. And I think that's the best. Like the briefings in StarCraft is like, is that great integration? No, but it's like it's compromising in a more elegant way than trying to jam the story into the gameplay. And but developers get so hung up on this, they'll start doing crazy shit. It's like, let's just take a step back, just make it a cutscene, dude. I know it's not perfect, but it's better than you having a mission where you walk through a hall having nightmares.
Yeah, or
4 times.
And the RTS
Yeah.
equivalent is like moving 3 units around instead of building a
Yes.
base, you know? When those
Exactly.
kinds of missions
Yeah.
crop up, it's
Those
just
types
such
of
a
missions fucking
buzzkill.
suck.
Yeah. I mean, it's because it's not even like a drill where you're like learning how to micro a unit or something.
anything.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just straight up, you have less gameplay now. And I don't know where that started. Like, it's been in basically every RTS that I've played.
Yeah.
So.
Broodcraft. Like old Warcrafts have
Yep.
that. Brood War has that.
The first Command and
Yeah.
Conquer has the commando missions, right? And so it's like
Yeah.
you've got literally one unit. So I don't know what's up with that, man. That's not my cup of tea. But yeah, and maybe that's even where you can trace like the lineage of MOBAs and stuff too. But as much as it's like, okay, sure, there's some interesting gameplay that you might be able to get out of it, it's clear that the game wasn't designed for it. And so just like you shouldn't make it, like levels or whatever you want, content where the game is not supporting that content or the premise of that content, you also shouldn't be doing that with a story either. Like the story or the setting or whatever, they need to be supported by what you have, what you can use, what you can make use of within your genre. And so I do think that a lot of designers
if
make
you
that
have
mistake.
to band-aid something in there, just remember, okay, this is a band-aid, let's make it skippable. Like maybe you can't fit everything in there and you really want to.
Yeah.
So you're just like, okay, I got to throw a cutscene in here. It's got to happen. But just make it skippable, please, for the love of God.
Yes, yeah, that'll at least help on repeat. One of the things that's kind of interesting is you mentioned like what will hurt replayability. Something I haven't seen people do in the RTS cut. I'm sure it's happened, but in RTS games, in levels, I have never seen the second time I play the mission, the dialogue is like snappier. And so we skip like maybe like a lot of the times I like to do this sort of convention where the start of a mission, especially if it's like the first mission in a campaign or something, maybe the intro is like a little bit more wordy. And so you listen to that the first time through, but if you keep losing and you keep restarting, that's just going to grate on you. And you can skip the dialogue. You can hit the escape key and it just like shortens the trigger or whatever. But if you don't know that, or if it's not occurring to you, it might just annoy you. And so what we do is like when you restart the tutorial, it basically becomes like a 3-sentence thing where it's like each character.
That's super smart.
Yeah, each character that's speaking in that mission has one line, and they basically establishes like the officer guy says, "I'm coming for you, cadet," and then your aide guy says, "Yeah," and I'm on comms, and then your guy is like, "Let's get it done" or something, and so that's it. That's just it's like over in 10 seconds.
That's so smart because. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, if you start to view the problem correctly, you can come up with much better solutions. So, like, if you start to view the problem of like, okay, the problem with story and gameplay is that on repeat, the story is going to start to degrade. So if you change it to like it's context sensitive, so on the second playthrough, your guy's not saying the same 15 lines. Instead, he's just like, we'll get him this time or something. You know?
Exactly.
It's like recognizing that the game is being replayed. That's so smart. Because now it's like, okay, we're on the right track here. Now it's like the game is recognizing that it's meant to be repeated. It's recognizing that repeating the same bullshit 15 times is going to drive players up the wall, and they're going to go to their option settings and they're going to take your text or your voice and slide that shit down to 0. I had to do that with the game that I just reviewed called Slave Zero X was the name of the game. It's like this kind of character actiony 2D beat 'em up type of thing, and it's got all this vocal comms just constantly. The idea of it is like, oh, it's nice that it's not like having cutscenes. I like that, so it's playing over top of the gameplay. But the problem is like, sure, the first time I'll listen to your vocal comms. I am not listening to that 15 times. So like, if they should take your idea of like, okay, we'll play the vocal comms the first time you play, then after that it'll switch off or it'll be a shorter thing or something.
Well, sometimes the event,
that's smart.
Yeah. Well, thank you. The event is sometimes also a read if you're repeating it, and like this happens, like I don't know, like somebody arrives in the middle of the map and they deploy as your ally. It's like you want to know that that's coming like a minute in advance, and so if we have a dialogue event that's there, then maybe we shorten that, but it's still there in the second playthrough, so that you know, like, okay, that's happening, right? Yeah. And so that it can still be useful from a communicating gameplay information using that. So you wouldn't want to necessarily skip all of them, but also like maybe that's an option in the settings too if somebody really doesn't like it. But I just think of it like definitely having, you can basically, like, I agree that putting it in and then making it skippable is a band-aid. And if you can, instead of having it be a band-aid, it just elegantly flows and like it accounts for all that. That's like kind of the designer dream of I accounted for everything. Like we have this joke, my brother and I play video games all the time, and oftentimes we're sat there like combing through like the Steam store and all these other stores looking for something, anything to save us from not being able to play a good game. And when we get through and we play something and something, it's very obvious that like this is a ham-fisted solution that doesn't work. We jokingly say, well, these developers thought of everything, because it's just like it's so obvious that like that doesn't work, but they had to do it because they didn't want to actually go in and solve the root problem. And so that feels like an option, right? It's like you shouldn't, as the player, you shouldn't have to go in and turn the volume to zero.
Turn the slider off. Yeah. There, you know, the sad thing too is that a lot of like reviewers and critics now, oh man, this happens all the time, where if it's at all possible to avoid on the user side, it's like fine. Yeah, so you'll complain, you'll say like for example, let's say your game starts to get a little bit more popular among RTS players, and this aspect of your game design where it shortens on the dialogue on the second repeat. Like if I was a reviewer of RTS games, right? Your game comes out, it has this feature, and I'm like, this is good. This is what games should do. Then your game has now set a precedent for reviewers and other games to be like, where's the secondary repeated dialogue skip? Where's that? But if no game does it, it doesn't become part of the paradigm. And so then you have to like have solutions of like, well, if you can turn off the voice, that's fine, right? Like, and so the problem is like a lot of players will accept really unelegant like workarounds rather than like expecting really smart design. And so like the game has like, it has to be done before people will accept it as like a thing that needs to be done.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've experienced this so many times because people and again, like I've been talking a lot about this stuff because it's all, honestly, it's what I've been doing. This is actually the first time we were having another one of these like interview conversation type deals on in some time. And because during that whole time I've been working on this game, and so it's very fresh in my head. But
I know how it is. Yeah.
The other thing to bring up that's on this topic is like people will come in and they'll be like, I never knew I wanted to play like a game like this until I played it, because there is no game that's quite like this. And, you know, I kind of think that this extends to like, I mean, it's a bit of a side tangent, but like, you know, you'd have different races or factions in an RTS. And I think of it kind of in the same way. It's like, if I made a new race, because we're going to add another race to the game this year. And it's like, if I add a fourth race and the game only had 3 races, and the fourth race is like not an overlap between the others, but like has some characteristics that are all its own that lend towards very different play styles. Like you were talking about how like Zerg feel more swarmy. And it's kind of interesting that like the Mutalisk magic box micro that stacks all the mutas is like really obviously not an intended feature, but it makes it feel like it's one organ out of many different organisms or something. Like it feels Zergy in that way. It's really weird how that worked out.
Very Zergy.
And it was totally like incidental, but that's the one that's most used. Like sometimes you'll see it with wraiths, but very often it's that. And so that's really interesting. But if I add a fourth race, and then that race is like, it fields your play, it gives you a vector to express a different play style that you like doing, it calls to you, it speaks to you, but you never would have guessed that happens. It's kind of like that, but like on an overall game level, it's like, here's a game that does something differently. And I'm sure you've had plenty of these kinds of experiences, just discovering some game that for the first time that has like,
I'll tell you the exact game that did this for me. It's a game called Devil Daggers. So it is an FPS type of game. So this was recommended to me by a patron one day. He just messaged me. He's like, I think you would like Devil Daggers. I look at it. It's like this FPS. It's got a cool like PS1 sort of vibe to it. I'm like, this seems kind of cool. I play Devil Daggers, and it is probably one of the most influential games I've played in my mind. In like, I think about this game all the time because it does all these things that I'm like, that's a good idea. But I never would have thought of that on my own. Oh, that's a good idea. But I never would have thought of that. Like it does so many. So I talk about this game all the time, and I had no idea this thing. It just appeared, and it was doing all these things that I didn't know I wanted games to do until it did it. Like one of the big ones is that Devil Daggers. You know, you're talking about like ladder anxiety and like ranked anxiety. That even happens with arcade games where people like if they play score attack mode, they're like more shy to play score attack mode because of the leaderboards and stuff. Anyway, what Devil Daggers does is it turns every time you play into ranked. Every time you play, it takes your PB every single time. You have no choice. You have to do it. But what the game does is it kind of just makes it feel like normal. Like, it's just like, "Oh, you're just playing Devil Daggers." And then when you get a PB, the game's like, "Oh boy," and it shows, like, your PB, and it shows your rank rising up the ladder, and it's like, "Oh my god, this game has figured it out." It's the best of both worlds. It gets you to play competitively, but it removes the anxiety because you have to. There's not that, like, and then it takes your PBs. So, like, when you do a really shitty run, it doesn't, like, shove the shitty run in your face and say, "Oh, you suck. Look how bad you are." Instead, it just sits and quietly waits for you to get a PB, and then once you get it, it's like, "Oh, you did it. You did it." And so Devil Daggers is, I don't play that many games for score. Like, I'm a little bit more selective. Devil Daggers is one of those games that, like, through sheer game design power, made me start doing it. Like, I'm like, "Oh my god, I like this." And so you get a PB in Devil Daggers, you're, like, popping off, and so the game within its own design, because I would have never tried to score competitively in it without this type of stuff. So now I look at that, I'm like, "Oh my god, arcade games need to do this. This is so brilliant. This is genius." And I don't think he came up with this system from arcade games. Like, he's definitely inspired by arcade games. It has a very arcade inspired design, but this leaderboard thing is revolutionary. I've never seen another game do this. And so I would have never thought to do that with a leaderboard until I played Devil Daggers. So, yeah, like, these types of things, you can't understand how good they are until they exist, basically.
Right. No, it's
Yeah.
gives me a lot of thoughts about like there's like probably a lot of cases where you have to make the initial translation of like FPS game or arcade game mechanic into whatever game you're working on. But I
Yeah.
feel like there's something to be gleaned from every game that is legitimately closer to masterpiece or whatever than IGN is talking about,
Yes.
obviously, right? Like
Yeah.
you can
And I would
find
say Devil
something,
Daggers is one.
right?
Yeah, like a legitimate masterpiece.
And you can find games that are like that out there in the world. Like we have a channel on our server called Good Games Exist. It's almost like
Yeah.
you have to say
Yeah.
that because some people forget it sometimes. So that's funny. And anyway, it's like every now and then we'll get like a recommendation for something, and it's never in the RTS genre, but I can find a way to take a good thing from that game and put it into this or whatever. And I can
Yeah.
translate the concept anyway, or see maybe it's something we're already doing, and I see it and I'm like, oh yeah, we do
Here's a
something like that.
suggestion
Hit me.
that I'm talking to RPG fans I'm gonna make a video about, which is scoring systems for your games. So, like, arcade games have developed scoring systems, have really honed that in because that's, like, one of their main design features. But I've recently been realizing Devil Daggers has scoring, obviously, that, like, a lot of other genres could benefit from scoring a lot, not just arcade games. Like, imagine, okay, like, let's talk about Brood War because that's the RTS I know really well. So you play, like, the campaign in Brood War, right? And then you have, like, a mode in Brood War, like score attack mode, or even you just build it into the campaign. Like, you 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 do things that are, like, more meta correct, and you get rewarded for them with, like, a scoring ranking system. So, like, let's say you harvested a shit ton of materials, you built, like, all these different encamps, you swarm the shit out of your enemies, you killed them really fast, and all these metrics are getting analyzed and then computed into a score so that so that even if you're a single player guy who never plays the competitive game online because you have ladder anxiety or you hate other people, I can understand that sometimes. You don't want to deal with other people. So you just want to play the game single player. But what you could do with the single player content is you could make a meta game within the single player content that mirrors the competitive game. So, like, your performance metrics are rewarded so that the single player person has a reason to play effectively beyond just getting the clear, or just, that's what we call in arcade games, just getting the win of the level. Like, there's a more meta reason to, like, play better even in this. So it adds replayability to the campaign. It adds performance metrics that you can't totally capture with just normal level design. Like, I think RPGs would really benefit from this, and I think there are a few RPGs with, like, kind of ranking scoring systems, but I think that's more of a if that was more of a standard for the single player content, I think it would have its own sort of life outside of just being a shuttle to the multiplayer. It's like, "Oh, I'm, like, the highest ranked single player on this map," and people just grinding your maps and stuff. It just adds so much depth and replayability that you can't get without it. So, that's something. Yes. It needs to be done well. Yeah. much better speedrunning. Right. Well, here's something you can do that this is some game design shit that, again, I think is getting rediscovered by more mainstream genres, is something called rank. Are you familiar with what rank is?
Just like, what do you mean by rank
Yeah,
exactly?
anyway, it's a arcade term. So what
Oh,
rank
okay, gotcha.
is when you're playing certain games like Battle Garega, for example, um, the developers of Battle Garega, the arcade board operators had a bit of a problem, which is arcade players, especially shmup players, turned into beasts. They were so good at these games. It's unhuman how good they got at the games. So what would happen is you run into a problem as a game designer, right? So arcade games, they need to you just walk up and you put a credit in and play, right? They need to be made for that context. But how do you account for this difficulty issue? Because you have massive disparities in skill. You've got a dude who walked into the arcade for the first time who's going to put his quarter in. You need him to play because he makes you money. But you can't make the game easy because then your hardcore customers who spend hundreds and some cases thousands of dollars sitting at your arcade, they need a way to keep playing. How do you do this? The answer was rank. So what rank is, another term for it is dynamic difficulty, which is that like as you get better and perform better, your score gets higher, the game gets harder, not easier, harder. So like with your campaign, let's say you add in some kind of rank dynamic and AI type stuff. So the first guy playing through it, it's like the base difficulty of what you want. But then the guy who's trying to go for like the world record scores on your map, like the enemies get more aggressive and there's like bonus spawns and like enemy, like more shit starts to happen the better you play and the better you score. And the way you could account for that is through the scoring system. So like as they're scoring more, the rank gets higher, the enemy gets more aggressive, bonus spawns or like surprise enemy attacks or whatever it would be. But in an RTS, but that's something to think about too, is rank. And I don't know if RTSs have that dynamic rank like that.
No, I feel like they've mostly steered clear of dynamic difficulty. The thing that I always thought was that if you could do dynamic difficulty well, because I'm familiar with it more in the context of like Half-Life 2, where it's like, oh, you're low on health, well, make the next pickup be health instead of whatever it was supposed to be. And then you
Yeah, yeah,
lose
yeah.
like any idea of like, oh, I'm specifically trying to find the spot that has health on the map or whatever.
Yeah,
That's like
yeah.
more interesting from a challenge standpoint. So I'm mostly used to it making games easier as opposed to harder.
Yes. Harder. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the only an arcade thing. It's
right,
only because in console games, it's not profitable to make the
right.
game harder.
Yeah.
There's no reason to do that. You're just shooting yourself in the foot, you know? It's only in the arcade environment because again, difficulty is content. You need that content because otherwise the dude's going to walk in, he's a hardcore player, he's going to beat your game in one try, he'll never play it again. So you need to it's funny. It's I think it's beautiful, but it's funny. It's like an inversion of how people look at game design. You want to punish players for playing well. But you're punishing them in the sense of making it harder, but you're rewarding them in the sense that you're giving them more content. You're giving them more depth. So if you think about it in that term, difficulty is content. You're actually rewarding them, but a lot of people won't see it that way in like mainstream sense because difficulty is punishment.
A
But
a lot of people will think of it that
yeah.
way. I mean, just
So the
like the number of
dynamic
people
difficult
who play the tutorial and then will be killed by it and like they'll lose in the tutorial. They'll think of that as a mark of shame when really what I'm trying to teach them is no, it's expected you will lose so you can get better, right?
yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
do think that's a challenge that I face in that
But I
respect.
think
So,
RTSs could really benefit from that in their single
yeah.
player campaigns where you get the better you get, you're
Mhm.
like top ladder player and you play the campaign and the campaign's like throwing everything at you.
Yeah.
You see, isn't that a cool idea?
I think
Dynamic
one of the ways that
difficulty, rank.
I could imagine it working in an RTS, because a lot of times you're playing against the same opponents in universe like multiple times
Yeah.
throughout like the whole campaign. And so the thing that I've thought of for a very long time now is what if you won the last time you fought against this particular character, you eliminated him by you eliminated his army using like air units and you like cheesed him or something. You did some cheeky strategy. And then the next time he like preemptively knows that, remembers that,
Yeah,
and
he's
puts like
got turrets
anti-air
there.
defenses. Yeah,
He's
exactly.
got turrets there or
Right.
something, yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's like a
yeah,
different map, it's
that's
a different
great.
scenario. And maybe it's like he's got a different team. Maybe it's even something like you attacked him with bio and he doesn't want to change his play style to account for that, but he has a different ally in the next mission than he would have if you attacked him with mech. And so it's like it's taking into account the player's strategies. And then like, because another thing that I wanted to say earlier about the story too, is that like, I think enough times, because you had pushed back over like the idea of characterization isn't really the same thing as plot, but I think like enough times of characterizing something and interactions within the things that are being characterized is almost like a plot of its own. And so if you think about it like, okay, I beat this guy in the tutorial, it's one mission, so that's not really a plot, but it's like, if I fight against this guy over and over, and there's like an evolving tale of like what I did in this campaign, that could be construed as a plot. But like in the context of anyway, the idea of the dynamic difficulty thing, I think that's actually what it's about. Like the single player content can be so much better if we have the idea of you're doing this for many times over. You're not only are you replaying
Build
it, but it's adapting. Yeah, it's adapting to you. And there's going to be some element of that that's always going to be there, even if we don't do like a deliberate like, oh, you beat us with this strategy, we're going to change our tactic as a result. Because we're designing our AI to be receptive, like scout and figure out what you're doing and then plan accordingly. So there's always going to be some adaptation intrinsic to the product. But the idea of like a very simple example is that I have like an AI in one of the early missions where if he scouts that you've built an air structure, or even he scouts an air unit, then he will respond by building anti-air defenses around his mineral line so that you can't harass his workers, right? And so it's like very basic stuff, and it's not that much of an expense, so it doesn't put him too far behind if he does do it, but it kind of like bare minimum protects him against like something like that. And so, but that's only if he scouts it. He's not going to blindly do it. He doesn't map hack and see that you've done it.
He needs to, that's great.
And so that's where if you can get it sneakily hidden somewhere and proxy it, you can surprise him at the same time while holding off his normal attack. Like then it's more like a conventional game where you're trying to do that against a real human player. Very small initial naive example, but it still works in that context. And so having stuff like that is already good. And I guess that's kind of borderline dynamic difficulty, but the idea of responding specifically to what the player has done to make their runs of the whole campaign more demand more adaptation, demand more from them, more of an understanding, a complete understanding of the game, I think is really cool, because now if you can't just use your same mech strategy over and over again, you got to start supplementing it because they've started to try to deploy counters to it. In a game that's got a rich enough game state is really cool, I think.
Yeah, that's why the scoring aspect of it's really important, because you need a metric to quantify that. Because if you have no metric for that, what you can do is, again, this is something that happens in arcade games, is you can, I don't know what the exact term for it is, but you can like lowball the rank. So for example, let's say that first map, it has the scouting guy, and I know that scouting guy is there, and I know if I do a certain thing, he'll adapt to that certain thing. What you can do, and this happens with games with rank if they're not careful, is you can do like lowball it. So you can do just enough to not trigger. You do just enough to not trigger the counter attack. You do just like you'd shoot him and like ward him off, but you wouldn't kill him. So you wouldn't trigger the counter. But if you have a competing metric against that score, like in order, okay, so like you counter him, you kill him, and then you get bonus enemies that spawn to attack, but you get score when those bonus enemies spawn. That score is then a counter incentive against lowballing, or whatever you call it. Sandbagging, it's a counter incentive. So if you have the rank scoring system, you can make the player, you can force the player to do things that are suboptimal for survival. That's what we call in arcade games. It's called survival. It's suboptimal for survival, but it's good for score. Grega has this all the time. You do shit that's really risky to survive, but it's lucrative for score. But if you don't have that scoring counter incentive, then the natural playstyle that will develop is that the players will learn to like avoid spawns and like avoid, like they'll ride that line, they'll find the line and they'll ride right along it. So they'll like ward off the enemy, they won't kill it, so they don't get the counter spawn. Then they'll attack the main base or whatever it is. Like, so that's why I think the scoring aspect of it is really underrated, because it's a counter incentive to just lowballing your AI or lowballing your level design.
Right. Yeah.
Sandbagging it. Yeah.
It's really interesting because in order to even attempt, if the product is well made, in order to attempt to sandbag or to ride that line, you need to really know the game. You need to have put like probably hundreds to thousands of hours
at that point.
Yes.
But, I mean, in terms of like super replayability.
Right. And I'm not saying it's not a bad thing. I'm saying it's like, I like the idea that I could make a product which would enrich somebody's life enough that they would keep coming back to it for that much time, just so that they could see if they could do that. You know what I mean? Like, that's why I kind of view as long as the speedrunning doesn't make a total mockery of the product, I kind of view it as like an honor in a way. It's like, oh, you care enough about the thing.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
or it's like
Yeah.
a sign that I'm doing a good enough job that you're paying enough attention to do it in the first place. And sometimes that can indeed pervert the game. Like you can find like, oh, if I stand here or do this, then
Speedrunning is so interesting because it's like both a compliment and an insult at the
yes.
same time.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a compliment because they like the game enough to keep playing it and they want to play it, but it's an insult because they are showing you that they want more from the game than you gave them. They want more. They wanted more from the game and you didn't give it to them. So now they have to like do this challenge to get more out of it. So it's like it's I think that's the way to view it. It's like a compliment and an insult at the same time. It's like it's showing that your fundamentals are strong, that your game design is attractive and fun and that people are into it, but it's also showing that you have this gap, that they have a meaning, there's some meaningless there where they need something else beyond just the what's on the page there, I guess. But for your characterization point, this will get a really like a highfalutin or whatever, but I think there is a distinctive difference between characterization and plot, just in terms of writing, not even in terms of game design. Like, for example, there are certain books that are written to actually be read and reread over and over. And then there are certain books that are written to be read one time. So, like, an example of a book that is meant to be read over and over is Catcher in the Rye. And the Catcher in Rye, plot wise, if you wrote down the plot points of Catcher in the Rye, it would be mundane. Oh, a kid gets kicked out of school. Oh, he hangs around in New York. Yeah. But that's because Salinger is putting much more emphasis on characterization. And characterization is much more repeatable form of storytelling because it's like you're experiencing the world and you're thinking and viewing the world through Holden's eyes. That's in my opinion, I overvalue that, but it's a certain style of writing that is character heavy but plot, because you can't have both. You know, there's only so much space on the page. You can't have both. And so, or you write like freaking War and Peace and it's 1,000 pages or whatever. But so with like game design, I think it's the same way. Like, I think it's smarter to invest those resources into like characterization, setting, that kind of thing, rather than like plots. Like, think of like all these movies and stuff that come out now where they have the twist at the end. But if you know the twist, like Angels and Demons or the Da Vinci Code or whatever, you know the twist. It's like, who gives a shit? You know, it's like a one trick pony. You got the plot, you get the twist at the end. That was a fun time or whatever. Knives Out or whatever. Oh, that was a fun time. But are you gonna rewatch that? Are you gonna continue to come back to that? Is it gonna like beyond? You know, it's a different style of writing. But I think one style of writing is better than the other when it comes to games. And I think games, like the characters, the plot, the setting, I think people do come back to that much more so than like plot shit.
I think
Like,
so too. Yeah, I think there's
yeah,
something. It's saying something more, something with more meaning, something with more content. If it's something that still gives you a little bit of a different, and not something trivial like, oh, I noticed this little hidden detail that only
yeah,
somebody would notice if they were trying to make a YouTube video about it or whatever. When I watched it the 27th time, it's like, well, that's like trivia. Maybe it can
yeah,
help you enrich like your understanding of the setting or whatever. But to me, it's more like that you're quibbling at that point. Like, no, what does it say to you and what does it mean to you? And that's the kind of thing that I think is much more evocative of something where
yeah,
you are having an experience and it does have a certain amount of meaning to it. And it's kind of like, even the thing is like, it's almost kind of gotten gauche to say this, but like I am looking for art that challenges me, which is why I'm looking for games which challenge me.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
you don't see, I guess like now it's almost like, I don't know. It's gotten very. We live in like a really weird ironic culture now. It feels like where it's kind of like silly to
Mhm.
say like, oh no, I really liked this thing. Like, what are you, some kind of,
Yeah, if
you
you
know?
ever read David Foster Wallace, he wrote this great book about this called Infinite Jest. It's all about that.
Oh,
It's all
okay,
about
yeah,
like
it's on my
how
list. So.
degrading. He wrote it in the 90s, but
Right.
it's all about how like in the internet age, it was just before the internet age, we're coming into this ironic culture, and the ironic culture is like a shield for our deeper emotions. And so like we can't, that starts to get blocked off in our media. And that's absolutely the case, especially with like games. Like, when was the last time you played a game and you're like, I think this is actually, ironically, one reason why so many people gravitate to Final Fantasy VII's story. It's because it's so earnest and heartfelt and like it's putting itself out there, like, whoa. So people gravitate, and I respect that. I actually respect that about the story. I'm just saying, it doesn't quite. It's not like gameplay a great thing, but story is great. But yeah, I think that's an interesting thing about stories that we see in a lot. Like, they're all very ironic and very like,
It's like
whatever. I'm so
wink, wink, nudge,
smart.
nudge. Like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
watching a movie right now. And it's like
yeah,
I hate stuff like that. Like I hate when the
yeah.
characters basically look at the camera and say stuff. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I think that's just a trap door that a lot of our generation writers do, because we're deeply uncomfortable to show that side of ourselves, even through writing, even not even like in person. It's even through writing. We're so uncomfortable to show that side of ourselves that we always have to have that little meta ironic
right,
guard up to be like,
yeah.
yeah.
It's a get out of jail free
Another
card.
reason
Like,
why I don't like stories and games so much is like,
yeah,
you see that all the time. And it's like, you know?
yes, it's
Or
just,
Marvel and all that shit.
yep,
It's like, oh yeah. Like, think of all the Marvel movies. They're all like that.
yep, yeah, because it's like if you take it too seriously, then what if somebody doesn't like it? And then you really did put your
Exactly. You
you
put
bared your
yourself out
soul,
there
you
and
know?
everyone like fucking
Yeah,
dunked on you.
right.
I
Yeah, I
think
don't
there's
know.
something beautiful about that personally, though.
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
putting yourself out there and being mocked. Whenever I see that, it's hard for me to like, even if it is like a little bit cringe or embarrassing, it's like hard for me to really like jump on that train
Mm.
so much.
I
But
don't. Yeah, I don't. I can't. I hate to say that I wish somebody didn't do that. You know what I mean? Like I can't really think of a time where somebody's done that, and I've thought you really shouldn't have done that. Like, no, actually, it's probably
well,
going to work out. You
irony,
know?
the ironic thing is our generation is so starved for that kind of stuff. That usually doesn't happen.
Right.
Usually, if you put something out there
Yeah.
heartfelt, people do connect with it. Then they get like super like aggressive if you come
Yes.
at it,
Yeah. Right.
So it usually does kind of work out, unless it's just a complete, mess. But
Yeah.
I think it's just people are afraid to do it in the first place.
Well, it's so funny because like right now in the current state of our game, I do pretty much almost all of the voice acting is me, but putting on a different voice. And so sometimes you'll get really silly things where it's like me obviously doing like a really bad accent, and yet I'm still like delivering like a voice actor would deliver. It just
Yeah.
happened to be not
Yeah.
be able to sell the voice or the accent exactly, but like the delivery is still like taking itself seriously, if you know what I mean. I don't like.
Yes.
I'm not like
Yeah.
doing like a little wink, like don't
Like
guys
Resident Evil
don't hit
2.
me. Yeah, yeah,
It's
right.
like old school. Yeah, there's something I miss so much about that old school voice acting in games.
Right.
And I think about voice acting a lot, even though I don't care about that much. Like, it's hard to explain. But
Right.
one thing I really love about voice acting in games of the past is like the actors were coming into these roles were just having fun,
Yeah.
because it did not affect their career in the slightest.
They
Like,
probably weren't even voice actors. Like all the Brood War voice actors were just
yeah, a
staff
lot of
members, right?
yes,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
But even the voice actors, like even the
Yeah.
voice actors that come in, they're like, G tier in terms of
Oh,
like
sure, yeah.
actors. Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of like popularity, money, this isn't, Kevin Spacey in Call of Duty. It's like some local theater actor who comes in and does some voice acting. But some of it's terrible, but some of it you can get like surprisingly like really earnest and like well done, because it's just for fun. Like it's not going to come back to them. So they go, some of those old voice actors, they just go ham. It's awesome. And now if you listen to voice actors now, because they know it kind of like could help their career, it could be like a bit. So it's very more like, it's close to the chest, very more like everyone's the same. Everyone sounds the same. Everyone's very limited. It's limited. That's what I say. It's not like cringe in a fun way, unfortunately, but it's not like good either.
No, it's
it's
vacant,
just kind of like
right? Yeah, there's just nothing
vacant.
going
Yeah,
on.
yeah. That sucks.
Yeah. Well, what wasn't vacant was pretty much this whole conversation. I actually got a lot out of this, and I really appreciate your time. And really, I do stand by what I said earlier. I do think there's like loads of other stuff that we could talk about more. Like we didn't even really get to cover intentional design that much in here. We just kind of
back. It can be the sequel. It can be the DLC for this episode.
That's it. Yeah. So if you guys
expansion pack,
right? You guys know who to PayPal if you need that.
Yeah.
So
send us $50 each if you want that episode.
There it is. There it is. So yeah, obviously in the description will be all your stuff. But is there any? I don't know if you want to tease anything that you're currently working on. You mentioned a couple of things.
I do.
Go ahead.
I do. It's a video I've already made, but I want to show it to cross audiences. So I have this documentary that I made January oh my God, it was like giving birth, how much work I put into that. But it's a shmup documentary, and it's called Passion Against Reason. And the reason why I'm promoting this video specifically, it already exists, is because I really want people who are not fans of shmups to see it. Because there's that kind of funny selection bias with the internet where, like, if you're a fan of shmups, it's like awesome, and here it is for you. But I made it specifically for people who don't understand shmups, who aren't into arcade games that much. It's not just like feel good. Oh, shmups are cool. Let's all have fun. It gets actually very dense and technical and like explains the genre in a way that I'm very proud of. It's like kind of my philosophy of game design is very much contained in that video, in that documentary. So I would love for people who aren't shmup fans, who are like RTS fans or fans of other genres, to check it out, and maybe they could kind of learn a little bit more about arcade game design and stuff, and see how it parallels the games
Right.
that they like.
Yeah, well, a lot of people listening to this, a lot of people watching this are people who do think deeply, or at least would like to think deeply, if not, about RTS games or games in general. And it's not really limited to one genre. It's very much like a widespread, like, oh, they like to hear thoughts. Like we've had puzzle designers on, like Jonathan Blow. We've had loads of other people on in the past who have done many other genres. So there's definitely a nice cross section of like general gamer, but also who are enthusiastic about thinking about it and discussing it deeply.
Well,
and
I
so,
sit and
absolutely.
think about I sit and watch, like, my favorite things now are watching like discussions of like genres outside of shmups and arcade games, because it's like that feels like kind of a little bit like work to me now. But when I hear about RTS games and RPGs and like other genres I'm less familiar with, I'm actually love that, because then I can relate it back to what I'm doing. So
And
I'm happy to be part of the club.
There it is. There it is. Yeah, the Frauds
Yeah.
Club. Yeah. Well, here for me, I definitely think that you've said a couple of things that you've given examples from arcade games and from games that you're more familiar with that I didn't know about. I didn't know they were doing that thing, and yet it reaffirms like the direction that I'm taking the RTS in with my work. And it's like, wait, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That does, of course, that would click. Of course, that would work, and of course, I can immediately see the parallel. And so it's helpful for me, at least. I'm sure it'll have been very thought provoking for a lot of other people. So again, Mark, thank you very much for your time, and everybody watching this can head on over to the Electric Underground. Maybe find a couple of videos that they like. Obviously, the exact one you mentioned for the Shmup documentary will be in the description as well, front and center. So check that out.
See you, everyone.